And hello, folks. Welcome to Totally Tanked. My name is John. It's the 11th of November, 2023. This is episode 52, and I am joined by...
Rob. Hi, we're Totally Tanked, the tankiest podcast in Tankville.
Rob, what tank are we talking about today?
The T-80, or the Object 219, and including the Black Eagle, and a little bit about it, the T-84.
Yeah, which is kind of the relationship between T-72 and T-90, you could loosely say is T-84 and T-80.
But we'll do a little bit about it.
Sure. So we can't observe a minute's silence in a podcast or video stream, but rest assured we have done our silence at the 11th hour this morning. Thoughts go out to all the fallen veterans and all those still struggling with the cost of their service. Okay, it's time to thank the patrons.
Thank our patrons. And I'm going to pour myself a beer while John talks.
Okay, so at the artificer level, we have Chris Peze, G Hook, Maxi Mixed and Pear. And then at the apprentice level are Anton Gorbanov, Brian Jenkins, Carter Heller, Chris Doyle, Corey, David Mulvaney, Fartmaster, Floaty Burb, Jay Beckman Strauss, Jamie Stokes, Jimmy O, who I think we missed a couple of months, but you're in now, Scotch 12, Spencer Davis, Steve Matthews, and Vikram Murthy. Okay, folks, and if you want an excellent Totally Tanked t-shirt, like such as I'm wearing one, guaranteed to start conversations with terrifying people, head over to redbubble.com and search for Totally Tanked.
Mine isn't Totally Tanked, but it does have a special meaning because my brothers got me this one for my birthday. They don't know much about tanks or podcasts, but they decided, right, we'll get him a t-shirt with a tank on it. So it's got the Type 97 on it, and away we go.
Yes, excellent. Okay. And I finally got the patrons, for those on the live stream, heading off behind us. So that's excellent. Alexander, Vlad, and Minty are with us. Alexander from Ottawa, and Minty is yet to tell us where they are.
Nova Scotia.
Oh, are they? Oh, yeah, good at Nova Scotia. Wow. Canada represent. Canada's always disappointed us. We don't get quite the numbers in Canada that we do in, say, the US or other places. But I'm sure, Canada's really coming good on the live stream. So there we go. All right, Rob.
Stats.
It's time for you to
bore everybody with stats.
Anger the rivet counters with your reading of things badly from Wikipedia. We will get to Mr. Dwyer later. But
I just like to make up some numbers here, there, and everywhere. It's all a bit of fun, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's not like somebody's going to be studying this as part of an entrance exam to something. And Etienne from California, welcome, and Max from Michigan. Welcome along.
Hello, everyone.
So, yes, the T-80. We got 5,500 of them built, plus a bit more, plus a few destroyed, put back together, pulled out of storage, upgraded, and so forth all along the line.
The numbers are actually really controversial.
And
it looks like the Soviets were actually cheating on the conventional forces in Europe treaty. So the production numbers are totally inaccurate, and there are tanks have turned up in places where they weren't supposed to be. So somewhere between 5,000 and 7,000, and the biggest experts in the world can't agree that there's a problem with the numbers.
As I say, some of us just like to make numbers up. All right, so with standard mass of a Russian tank around 42.5 tons and going up as they bolt extra bits and pieces on. So more armor, more imaging systems, more rockets and everything else, up to about 46. I even saw a number for a 51 tons for one of the T-80 UMs, I want to say. No, actually, it was a T-80A. That's the one. Length 7.4 meters or 24 feet and a bit. Width.
It was a little bit longer than the normal for the Russians,
yes.
Like about a meter longer.
Yep. So they got more stuff, obviously, to fit in the gas turbine. They need a bit of extra room because your little diesels can fit in smaller spaces, is what I'm guessing. Width 3.4 meters, so again, standard, slightly wider than the T-72s. Height 2.2 meters, so again, similar to all the others. Crew of 3. Now, that's no change for any of the Russian tanks around.
Let's go through that, though. So you've got commander, gunner, autoloader, driver.
Yes. Autoloader being the fourth crewman.
Yeah. Or the lack of a crewman, but yeah.
All right. Main armament, we've got the smoothbore 125 mil gun with the upgrades of the gun allowing different better ammo firing ATGMs, anti-tank guided missiles, the Cobra, the Sniper, the Reflex, the Verve, the all sorts of different names thrown in there as over time, because the tank's been around since 1976. So as they and they've started putting ATGMs in there from 78.
It was a new capability at the time, the ATGMs, but it's become very standard for Russian tanks.
Yeah.
Not that they ever seem to actually put them in the field with these missiles.
Yeah, expensive.
Yeah.
All right, Alan's here as well. And Brendan makes stuff. Welcome along, Brandon.
Oh, Alan's got some friends over too. Okay, good stuff.
Good on you, Alan.
Everyone gather around the telly to watch the... my nephew Angus might be watching as well. So hello, Angus, if you're out there.
Hey, is the one over in the UK?
No, that's down in Tuggeranong.
Oh, okay. Oh, lovely.
Yes, no, Sheridan was going to get them on the stream.
Well, there you go. So we'll keep the language clean, won't we, John?
We always do. I always do.
You always do.
Yeah.
I get excited. So with the 125mm gun, they've improved it over time. Went from carrying 36 rounds in the tank to up to 45 rounds of various types. It's got -5 degrees gun depression, up to 14 degrees maximum elevation.
So again, the standard Soviet design, not very good elevation and
No.
depression.
No, not when you're surrounded by five-story buildings. You got a coax 762 PKT in the turret, and then you've got you got the different choices. You got depending on which version you're looking at, you've got different choices for the external 50 cal, or sorry, 12.7mm NSVT or DHK or PKT anti-aircraft machine gun.
Now, for those on the video stream or people listening, I will put the slides from the video up on our social media, Facebook and Twitter mostly. The T-80 had quite a weird in some of the variants. It's almost like a little upright coffin that the commander can slide into with a little clear faceplate, so he can see sort of in a head-up but semi-protected, but probably not as protected as he'd like to be, and use quite an array of weapons. I've never seen it on anything but T-80s. And it looks like a really, really bad idea. And obviously, the Western countries go with just complete remote weapon stations instead of having a weird coffin to stuff yourself into.
So yes, they started out with a single pintle mount. Then they went to a remote operated weapon station for the external gun, and then they said, we're going to take that off. And what we're going to do is we're going to put 4 different pintle mount points, so you can mount your machine gun at any different corner of the turret and then use it from there. So you can mount it at the front of the turret, the rear of the turret, left or right. So your commander, your gunner can be firing from front, forward or backwards. So they gave the choice there. And yeah, it was... I mean, obviously they've got different ideas of where they wanted to put it and why they wanted to put it there. But whereas, as you said, most Western countries have said, let's make it remote operated.
But that's if you've got access to lots of cheap electronics, which is all mostly made in Taiwan and China. Then you can do things that I mean, we will get to the T-80's resurrection, but the fact it is a tank that Russians can build is very important.
Now, the important part about the T-80 is the engine. Started out with the 1,000 horsepower gas turbine multi-fuel engine. Then they upped it to 1,100 horsepower, then 1,200, then 1,250. Then they along the way they also decided to build some diesel versions up to 1,000. Started out again at 1,000 horsepower. Then nowadays they're up to 1,250 horsepower in the diesel engine.
Now I saw a really interesting statistic about the engine that really makes a lot of things that we're going to talk about make sense, which is that the engine costs 10 times as much as the engines in the T-90s and T-72s.
Well, there you go.
And it doesn't last as long, and we will talk at great length about the fuel consumption, which is horrible. But so there are real reasons why the Russians were hot and cold on this tank.
Hot and cold being 2 definite reasons for the tank. Anyway, so we've got the transmission, which is starts out as a manual 5 forward gears, 1 reverse, and for the and it's got the faster reverse speeds than other Russian tanks. So it's got 11 kilometers an hour in the reverse, John, versus the 5 kilometers an hour for the others.
Mean, 11 doesn't sound like a lot, but you are at least getting to faster than walking pace.
Yes.
Whereas 5 is literal walking pace.
Yes. So it's not But we'll discuss about how they're now saying, you know what, reverse speeds is probably something we need,
It's not trivial.
and with the gas turbine, it's probably easy to achieve. So, because they've
Yeah.
got a lot of power there and got a lot of torque, so you can try and do that. Torsion bar suspension, it's got a ground clearance of very little, one and a bit feet. Fuel capacity 1,100 litres.
That's not that much. Tankers can normally sleep under tanks, but 1.2 feet you couldn't.
No,
It's,
no,
yeah.
you don't sleep under tanks anyway because
Sometimes they sink,
Yeah,
but they still do it.
that's what the engine decks are for. And plus, they also carry 740 litres in external fuel tanks that you can that the Russian tanks are. Always stand out in the crowd by having these two great big fuel tanks hanging off the rear.
I mean, Centurion did it too, but yeah, it's definitely a feature of Russian tanks.
What about the monowheel?
Well, British have good ideas and bad ideas.
Range 335 kilometers without external tanks, 415 width. Speed, now this is where it all kicks into gear. It can go up to, they say, 80 kilometers an hour.
And I actually believe them in this case.
Oh, yeah,
I mean, it does get called the flying tank a lot.
Yeah, there's plenty of times, lots of videos of the flying tank that goes off ramps on the tank biathlon and so forth, and gets about 10 meters worth of leaping through the air. So yeah, it's pretty quick with that gas turbine engine. 48 kilometers an hour off-road, cross-country. So plenty of movement there. All right. Now, John, tell us about some key dates and development.
So the development story's interesting to the point I've actually, for the first time ever in this podcast, written out the development history. So in 1949, the Soviets had an idea. Jet engines were extremely new, and they said, "Hey, what if we take one of these jet turbines and use it as a tank engine?" And this was in 1949. They were way ahead of the world. Their problem in 1949 was that they didn't actually know how to make jet engines, but they got lucky. Where did the Soviets get their jet technology from, Rob?
Aliens must have given it to them.
Yes.
Aliens?
Now, a lot of people would be like, oh, they captured it from the Germans. But no, the German engines weren't that great. The British had much better engines. And they sold it to them. And it's one of those late British Empire moments where there's no one's got
really want the money.
They wanted the money. And there were a lot of communist fellow travellers in particularly the post-war Attlee government. And they just decided to give them to the Soviets at literally the same time they were selling the same engines and designs to the Americans.
Okay, just a quick question from Da Etienne. I hope that's the way we're saying it. I'm going with the French pronunciation. External fuel tanks, they're fine for tanks because they're actually with gas turbines, they might actually be a bit more explosive rather than the diesel tanks. Hey,
they often still just use diesel in them, but I mean, it's all kerosene.
Yeah, true.
But basically, if they get hit, there might be a fire on the back, but it's not an explosion.
Yeah.
And whatever's hit them to cause the fire, it means the fuel's all draining out. If the tanks keeps moving, it's fine. But in general, they'll try and drain those tanks before they get into a combat situation.
There you go. All right, so there you go, Da.
Yeah. Okay, so 1957 rolls around. They've been working on this, and obviously MiG-15s have been terrorizing Western pilots over Korea in the meantime with their British engines. But 1957 rolls around. Object 278 gets built. It's a hybrid of a IS-8, I think, and a T-10. Weighs in at 54 tons. It has a 130 millimeter gun. It's able to hit 57 kilometers an hour, and with 2,000 liters of fuel, it can reach 300 kilometers. Which
That's a lot of fuel.
Yeah, it's a lot of fuel. Okay, and then in 1963. Morozov, the infamous A.A. Morozov, who kind of sort of built the T-34 and definitely was involved in the 54, 55s and the T-64s. He's saying, hang on, I want to do some stuff with turbine engines. He's trying to get it into the T-64. In the end, of course, they went with a hideously complicated multi-fuel opposed piston engine, which they didn't figure out until the 2000s. They started that. Also, the Uralvagon Zavod, which is the main, to this day, the main Tankergrad tank factory. They're starting with their own turbine tank. They're really keen on the idea. Everyone in Russian tank design is like, turbines are going to be the future, which is kind of funny in that the world's most famous turbine tank is the American M1, which entered service much later, but the Russians were really madly working on this. In 1964, Nikita Khrushchev killed off the turbine tanks because he'd looked at the fuel consumption numbers and said, this is mad.
Because it's not like they have any fuel in Russia. Oh, sorry, the Soviet Union.
They had fuel, but they didn't have so much to just waste it. And when you're equipping tank armies, this stuff's really adding up. And also, the Russians have never had, and still don't have, the same sort of infrastructure that the Americans do to get fuel to the tanks in the field. Although I was reading a really interesting piece by Big Surge about the troubles with fuel constraints in Normandy in 1944. Anywho, 1969, Nikolai Popov designs Object 219. So this is actually the birth of the T-80. Now, this is basically a T-64 with a 1,000 horsepower turbine. And at this point, they go, the suspension in the T-64 is not up to the power, the speed, and the weight of
basically things start falling and ripping apart as they start going, because they're going so fast. Everything is going at much higher speeds inside the tank. All little bits, the wheels that are supposed to move to keep things going, start shredding themselves. So, yeah.
Okay, 1974 rolls around, and Defense Minister Andrei Grechko basically says, you people are completely insane. We can't afford the fuel use on these things. Kill off all these turbine tank projects. We don't want them. He then promptly dies.
In April 1974.
The new Defense Minister, Dmitry Ustinov, he loves fast, heavy tanks. And in 1976, Object 219 becomes the T-80.
Yeah, so
the first tank in the world with a turbine engine, and the last major Soviet tank design.
That's actually in production, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. All right.
And the funny thing is, partly because they didn't sell them to other Eastern European armies, NATO sources in the 70s cannot tell the difference between a T-80 and a T-72, and they get mixed up all the time. And it certainly makes us feel better about that. Our followers on social media, when we do monthly What's the Next Tank, Guess the Tank, from a silhouette, really struggled. I think the only one of our audience who got it was Bjorn, who knows his tanks. But normally people are, identifying the particular,
within a minute.
Yeah, and also, but the tank, giving us the serial number of the tank from its silhouette. And the T-80 really flummoxed people, which I think plays into that whole thing that it's just not that well known. I remember when I was on Radio War Nerd at the start of the year, and they said, "What about the T-80?" And I was kind of like, "Oh, well, we haven't done the T-80 yet." then I filled a bit, but it's an interesting one. I mean, between 5,000 and 7,000 of them made. Major war service, still quite a little known tank in the West, and for a long period at the end of the Soviet Union, it was something like 60% of the Russian tank forces.
Really?
Yeah, it made up a huge number of them before they said, we're not building any more of these, and ramped up T-72 and then T-90 production.
There you go.
Yes. So T-80, so it's worth giving credit here. It's a product of the SKB-2 Design Bureau from the Kirov factory, which is in Leningrad. So it's not the really famous ones at Uralvagon Zavod, which is in Chelyabinsk, or A.A. Morozov's Kharkiv factory in Ukraine. But Leningrad, the Kirov factory, has played a major role in tank design in world history, and this is their tank.
Hesh is saying a very inconspicuous snorkel system. Yes, they do have a snorkel system on it. They can forward 1.2 meters, and with the snorkels, they can go up to 5.
Now, at the time it came in, the T-80 had the best power-to-weight ratio in the world, with 43 tons of weight and 1,000 horsepower. and that's partly why it's called the flying tank. It's still highly competitive. And one of the features that they gave it was an infrared camouflage paint, in that when viewed in infrared, its lines were broken up, which was
Magic paint.
Magic paint.
Magic paint.
Yes.
Well, I don't think that came around initially. Again, like with the engine power, is that they improved this thing over time. From the first version that came out in '76, they were a little bit dodgy, but over time they have seen people saying at the end of the '80s it was probably the best tank in the world at that stage.
Now, then we get to 1996, and
So the Soviet Union's fallen.
Soviet Union's fallen, and the Chechen War kicks off. And just a personal thing, I was in Moscow, traveling to China on the railways, and in the big train station in Moscow, I could see all the conscripts getting lined up to go on the troop trains to Chechnya, but I was on a holiday. Anyway, the debacle in Grozny. Let's briefly digress into that, because what happened was that the Russians pulled a whole bunch of tanks out of storage, gave them to troops that had never used them, and said advance into Grozny. And what the troops who had been given this tank did not know was that the T-80 idling was using almost exactly as much fuel as if it was moving. And the M1s would eventually solve this with an auxiliary power unit, but no one had figured this out at this point. The Russian generals were, in my view, entirely negligent in not knowing about the how to handle their tanks. And basically the T-80s in the heart of Grozny all ran out of fuel and then were decimated by Chechen fighters. There was a major debacle and defeated Russian forces.
Yeah, so for those who don't know, actually we'll get onto that conflict later on. We'll talk more about it.
But in my view, this was as if a general was given command of horse cavalry and didn't know that you need to water the horses every 6 hours. And then when the horses all died, complained, "Oh, horses are useless," when the problem was that he had failed to properly supply them. So that was Colonel General Alexander Galkin, who did a very good job in Russia of blaming everything on the no good T-80 tanks, and said we should never use turbine tanks again. They're rubbish, and the future of Russian tanks is going to be the T-90. Which we will get onto how the Ukraine war has shown he was extremely wrong.
But so basically, from there, they shut down production of the T-80s in Russia until
the well, okay. I mean, the Omsk plant did keep churning them out to fulfill export contracts. In particular, the South Koreans are quite an unusual little operator. And Ukraine had kept producing the T-80UD, which had a diesel engine in it that also threw out 1,000 horsepower. So they'd seemed to have solved a lot of the problems there. And then we get to the T-84, which is the Ukrainian design. Interesting, they're still following the same numbering heritage as the Russians. There's going to come a point where they both want to use the same number, and I don't think they're going to play nice about that. Okay, so when you get to the T-84, that does include a turret bustle for the ammo storage. So the carousel autoloader is gone, and it's a more Western style bustle. I'd love to see some more on how that works. And then you've also got the T-84 120 Yataghan, which is my favorite sword. I don't know. I own a lot of swords, but I don't own a Yataghan. I'd really like one. It's a Turkish design. The French stole it for their bayonets because it's got a really cool recurve that does some. You can thrust like a pokey sword, but cut like a saber. Anyway. Sorry, I digress.
You do.
So the point with the T-84 120 Yataghan is it's got a NATO compatible 120mm smoothbore, which can take Rheinmetall 120
That's the one.
ammunition.
So yeah, so that was the Ukrainians were building that for a Turkish tender to supply Turkey with the T-84 120 Yataghans, which is Yataghan being a Turkish sword, I guess. That's why it was called that. So and going from there, yeah.
So, and here's the crazy thing, and this is literally the reason why I said we've got to do the T-80 as our next tank. Uralvagon has announced they're going to restart production of the T-80. As a result of the experiences in Ukraine, they've said, you know what, T-90, not as good as we thought it was. The guys using the T-80s are doing well and not dying in the same sort of numbers. One interesting one, a lot of the users of the T-80s, you've got the 4th Guards Tank Division, which is part of the 1st Guards Tank Army. And it's a unit that seems to have its act together, so it would have done well even if it had T-72s or T-90s. And the other thing is the Russian naval infantry, and because they're Russians, even the naval infantry have a lot of tanks, are heavy users of the T-80, and again, those units seem to have their act together more than the other ones, but partly they're also just doing well because
they're professionals.
Well, also they're professionals, but they have a tank that can get out of trouble without having to turn. And when you turn, you expose your sights and your rear, which is the weakest point of the tank.
And because the tanks, the way that you keep the weight down on these tanks is by not having armor all the way around. You have the armor facing towards the enemy.
Yeah, so the armor aligns with the axis of threat, but that means that if you need to withdraw, which is going to happen to anyone even on a good day, your choices with a Russian tank with a walking pace, reverse speed, is you have to remain exposed, or the T-80 it can reverse and be exposed for half the time. The slower tanks have to try and do a turn in the face of enemy fire, and suddenly are much more vulnerable and have been destroyed in large numbers. Yes, so I think we've discussed that bit.
Did you? Yeah.
So what we're getting though is that the peer tank conflict in Ukraine has really shown up that the compromises the T-72 makes to be easy to maintain, cheap to build, are too much even for the Russians, and the Russians don't care much about the lives of their crews. But for them, it's been too much, and the T-80 design has basically been vindicated. And they stopped production in the 90s, and it's going on 20 years later. Going on 30 years later, 25 years later. It's suddenly being brought back into production. I think a part of that is because of the embargoes. The Russians, are just like, this was something we could build in the 80s. We can stop build it now.
That's right. So they've opened up the plant. So not only are they upgrading existing tanks that they're pulling out of storage, and we'll get onto that a bit, they're also building new ones because, as you said, they can build these the T-80s domestically without imported components. One of the other things they're also building the new tanks with is some anti-drone jamming modules. They're now being produced and mounted. So 2 of these little nodules are being mounted to the side of or anywhere on the hull of the tank, and it jams any radio signals to drones that might be carrying a little bomb into your tank.
Look, this gets down to the infamous night in Cairns when I tried to argue with the chieftain about the need to have electronic warfare operators in the tank, and I believe I am going to be vindicated by history. The issue is you can have a module, but if you've got an electronic warfare module on and it's on all the time, you're radiating your position.
Yep.
So you need to be able to exercise some discretion. You need to have passive sensors that is telling you there's a thing around. Because particularly small drones with their little engines going whiz, 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 highly radiating. There's a lot of, it's not quite visible sparks, but that you can sense them. And then you can say, "Oh, we're going to need to turn on the jammer." But it's taken a long time in the Ukraine war. I mean, I know that it's only been a couple of years, but all drones are jammable, and the future of drones is going to have to be full autonomy. But at the moment, they still rely on human operators, and that's all jammable. But it's taken a long time, and a lot of people have died to get this through the procurement chain. Hang on, we need to get these jammers in.
So one thing about the gas turbine engine is much quieter than the diesel engines in the T-72s and T-90s. So you'd think you're right about these anti-drone modules being mounted to these tanks, and they're basically putting out a huge electronic signature saying, "I am a tank and I'm here and I'm blocking all the radio signals around me." One, it stops your drones coming in, but also limits your own radio usage in and around the tank. Now, I'm sure there is very clever ways of signal encryption to be able to get around that, so you can still use your radio. But that would then happen if you can do that, then the drones can probably do it as well. But you're right about the sound the drones make, and if you've got a much quieter tank, you might be able to scan for the old
acoustic sensors too. Yeah.
Acoustic sensors, just saying, okay, I know what the. I mean, you can see I'm seeing ads for it on Google phones these days of eliminate these sounds and only scan for and only use these sounds. So. If you've got it in your phone technology, obviously you should be able to do that, something like that. And so, as the drones are coming in, your tank picks up that signal and flicks on your jamming signal, and away you go.
Yeah, I mean it's going to be an arms race in this one, as is always with every system in warfare. But drones can use quieter prop designs, but then they trade off power. It's going to be a really interesting space. Drones aren't an insurmountable problem, just like tanks aren't an insurmountable problem on the battlefield, but they are a problem, and they have to be addressed.
And you have to have the right resources in the right place. Is the big point about any sort of conflict.
But I mean, you just look at Ukraine. The case, great example. Poor old Ukrainians were trying to do armored thrusts across uncleared minefields, with no air support that could even shoot down helicopters, let alone drones. And they desperately needed to have those, facilities. When I'm talking about anti-aircraft batteries, basically to knock out helicopters.
You can't get those too close, otherwise the drones come along and find them, and you get hit by rockets.
Yeah,
which is always the point. Anyway, conflicts. All right, so as John was saying, it was introduced in 1976. And guess what happened in 1980? The Russians rolled into Afghanistan, but it was too secret and not very good in the heat with the gas turbines and the dust.
Turbines hate Afghanistan.
Yep.
The Allies in the recent conflict there had enormous troubles with even getting planes that could take off from the height and the heat. Similarly, turbine tanks don't love it either. But that does give the counter argument of where the T-80 really shines, and whether even when the Russians were down on it, it shone as anywhere it's really cold. It loves the cold.
Yeah, so that's why they've got the naval infantry divisions, or whatever they are, have them, because they're situated in places where the Russian Navy is, which is usually cold water ports surrounded by ice and snow. And so if you're going to have troops stationed there, you may as well have Navy troops stationed there rather than Army troops, because they're all, that way you don't get conflicts in who's in charge of all these people standing around Archangel and Murmansk. And that's why so the gas turbines work very well in the freezing cold. And guess what Russia has? Lots of, John?
Cold.
Lots and lots of cold. So yes, that's why it's. I'll get onto the distribution of the tanks at some stage.
I think I might have told this before on the podcast, so I'll tell it again. One of my favorite stories that gets told about how the fallibility of AI was that someone was trying to train an algorithm to identify Russian tanks. Obviously, a really cool thing. If you could pop that into a drone, it'll just go out and kill the Russian tanks. That's great. And what they realized was that all the algorithm was doing was spotting snow. They were like, the algorithm's great, it's 80% effective. And then they realized the photos they were trying to train it on were mostly the Russian tanks were on snow. So, yes.
Yeah, there you go. All right, so
the robots are coming for our jobs, but they'll get a few things wrong along the way.
Now I haven't fully confirmed this next one, but in Russia in 1991, during the August coup, when the Gang of Eight took over Mikhail Gorbachev, locked him in his dacha, and then took over the parliament. Boris Yeltsin was climbing on top of T-80 and talked the army into stopping the coup and defending the parliament. Also known as the White House, and so that was his big moment. And basically, he was the he from that moment of standing on top of the T-80 in it wasn't Red Square, it was outside the front of
it's not far from Red Square, but
it's outside the front of the White House, as it were.
But the 4th Guards Tank Division, which has been using the T-80s with great success in Ukraine, was based around Moscow, and all of these coups and counter coups of Russia in the 90s, the 4th Guards Tank Division basically turned up with the troops and would decide who they were going to take orders from.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Boris Yeltsin standing on top of this, basically this is his big moment in history, and basically stopped the coup from that point. It was still the Soviet Union at that stage, and they were able to. And as soon as this coup actually happened, that's when all the now countries started breaking away from the Soviet Union, saying, "Well, bugger you lot, we're going to go off and do our own thing." So go from there.
Fall of the Soviet Union, a touch more complicated than that.
Oh, yeah, very complicated.
Let's move on because we're talking about tanks.
All right, which brings us back to Boris and the T-80.
Yeah,
And
there was Boris the hero and then Boris the villain. And
And during the 1993 October constitutional crisis, this is when Boris Yeltsin ordered those same tanks to shell the Parliament, aka the White House, and so in doing so, consolidated power in the president of Russia, because this is now Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union, which then led to Vlad some years later having all the power he could dream of, and basically not having to be beholden to anybody and can do whatever he likes, which has continued to this day. So yes, this was Boris. Yes, so they got everybody in the White House to. They said, look, we're going to start shelling from the top, so forces everybody down, and then we're going to send the special forces in to take over the Parliament to and stop these people who are trying to take away the president's powers. Who he's just given himself lots more power, and some people in Parliament didn't like that.
Yeah, it's one of those things. People are like, oh, why would Russians, tolerate Vladimir Putin's dictatorship? It's like, well, compared to the chaos that came before him, he just seems not quite as terrible.
Yeah. He's making lots of people lots of money, except for all the people who aren't making money.
I mean, people talk about the fall of the Roman Republic. Isn't this terrible? The Republican ideals lost, and it's like people were sick of civil war. That had 40 years of civil war, and then it's like, no, fine, have an emperor.
Does he make the trains run on time?
Or does he just stop the murdering gangs of thugs marauding the landscape? Yes.
Yeah. All right. Then we get into the First Chechen War. So this was from December 1994 to January 95, and this is where the 4 columns of Russian troops had rolled into Grozny, the capital of...
Rumbled, I think, Rob.
Rumbled, yes. Well, no, because of the gas turbines.
Yeah, the tracks rumbled.
Yeah, yes. Yeah. We're into Grozny, which is the capital of Chechnya. The Chechen capital, and they got in there, and some of them said, "Oh, look, we've achieved our first day's goals. Nobody's bloody shooting at us. What are we going to keep on? Let's keep on going. Let's keep on going." And they got into the train station. One of the Chechen commanders who had obviously a lot of the Chechens had previously been Soviet soldiers working in Afghanistan, had reached out to his colonel comrade in the Russian force and said, look, you guys should really leave, and we should talk about things. And when the Russians said, well, I don't have the authority to do that, this is all I'm told that I read some stuff about this happening. Whether or not it actually did, who knows. And then after the Russian colonel in charge of that group said, I can't do anything about it, that's when the call came over the Russian radio, unleash hell or something. No, it was welcome to hell. Welcome to hell. And that's when in front of around the train station of Grozny, that Russian battle group got lit up very nastily by all the Chechen soldiers, militia and veterans and everything else. And it's a lot of T-80s. They were in conflict for the next 3 days, stuck there. The Chechens had access to the same radio signals and same communications. They can all speak Russian.
An enormous number of the Chechen rebels were ex-Soviet soldiers
who'd been fighting in Afghanistan.
And quite possibly had more knowledge of how to operate a T-80 than the Russians who were actually trying to operate them.
Yeah, and because of the gun elevation depression, they knew that
That was why the BMP Terminators were made
Yes.
to address this problem.
that's they knew that the guns couldn't fire into basements of buildings that in this great big city that they'd rolled into the middle of, and they also couldn't elevate.
I think
height.
that's the first time Grozny's ever been called a great big city, Rob.
It was large.
It's a big city for Chechnya, but
Yeah. It's bigger than Canberra.
it's bigger than Canberra. Okay.
All right.
No one's called Canberra a great big city ever. Right.
But again, remember, all these buildings were made during the Soviet era, so they all had bomb shelters. They all had, they're all hardened and everything else. Lots of concrete, lots and lots and lots of concrete. They are firing RPGs out of basements into these tanks that couldn't depress their guns to fire into them.
Oh, and firing from the rooftops.
And firing from the roof because the guns also couldn't elevate high enough in order to take out troops higher than the third floor of a building nearby. So,
I mean, Russian tanks inspired the Daleks, and there's a lot of crossover.
we can't do stairs. Oh man! I just wait till the Russians figure out field technology and be able to go up and down stairs, baby.
Yeah. So that's a Doctor Who joke for the Americans. Some of you watch Doctor Who.
Lots of them do. The new Doctor Who coming out in 2 weeks' time.
I'm so looking forward to it.
Yeah, 60th anniversary. Okay.
Also, just having David Tennant back.
Jodie was fine. The writers were. Anyway, okay, they missed out on the Second Chechen War in 1999.
Because at this point, the Russian brass were, blaming the T-80 for their own miserable failings. We're like, oh no, we're not going to use that.
So they won the first battle of Grozny eventually 2 months later after huge losses, and kicked out the Chechen forces. But in 2 years later, the Chechens came back in, took over Grozny and the rest of the country. And it was only 3 years later in 1999 when they went in for the Second Chechen War to oust the Chechen government and take over there. Then the T-80 and the T-80s weren't involved in the Second Chechen War in 1999. They also missed out in South Ossetia, which was in Georgia. Do you remember the days when that was happening, John? And Google Maps, everybody was worried that the Russians were invading Georgia. And
yeah, I mean, I think that was the same time as the Jade Helm scares were going off. Yeah, I mean, the multiple Georges of the world is one of life's great joys. So that was you've got the Georgia Islands near the Falklands. And of course you've got Georgia in the US. Which General Sherman improved enormously, and then you've got a whole country in the Caucasus. So that was South Ossetia. That was 2008. That was the first time it happened straight after the Winter Olympics. And then the Crimea invasion of 2014. So it didn't get a Guernsey then. However, guess what? It is being used in the latest invasion of Ukraine since last year. Mm-hmm. Sorry, you're saying 2014 they didn't use the T-80s?
No.
Okay.
Yeah.
So they still were down on them, and it's funny how this conflict, which has really dragged out, serious armored warfares, when they're like, oh, the guys who use this thing don't die.
But it is in use right now in the war in Ukraine by both sides. And the other one I thought to mention is, if they're not all already destroyed, there are probably a number of T-80s running around in Yemen fighting on either side. Well, could be fighting on either side as part of the civil war, because Yemen had T-80s delivered to them as prior to the civil war in 2014. Starting in 2014. So those tanks, if they're not all destroyed, and I don't know, it could be on either side and still running around.
I mean, fueling up or even maintaining a T-80 in Yemen would be tough work. But as we know, it's amazing how resourceful people can be. Yeah.
All right. Now we've got had some questions inspired by the Dark Star.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, the Javelin will still send the turret into orbit as a.
Yeah. No. Well, I mean, the T-64 and the T-80 have a similar autoloader to the 72 and the 90.
I can never remember
But
which ones.
no, it's the 64. It's the even number one. The 64s and the 80s, where half of it is upright and half of it's lying flat instead of all of it lying flat. So it's a little less vulnerable to a top penetrator setting off the carousel, but still quite vulnerable.
Yeah. All right. So users, operators of the T-80. So the Soviets, surprisingly enough, has been the ones who built them all. However, like the T-64, they were only used by the Soviets and not provided to Warsaw Pact allies. And also, like the T-64, they were kept in the tank divisions rather than provided to the motor rifle divisions, which are your bulk of your army. So it still wasn't listed as a breakthrough tank from the doctrines that I read about it. It was, but even though it was provided to the tank division, so whereas the T-64 was listed as a breakthrough tank. So
I think they've moved away from that concept in general, but yeah.
So yeah, it was designed as with most Russian tanks of driving through the Fulda Gap and the North German plains and invading Western Europe and cutting off the West from the North Sea and all that sort of fun stuff back in the 80s during the Cold War when Star Wars and everything else was going on. However, because it was mainly sent to the cold places in the Soviet Union, of which there are many, as the gas turbines performed much better than the diesel engines in the really cold weather. And it didn't perform because the gas turbines also don't perform well in dry, dusty places because the dust gets into the
filters. You have good filters.
You got to have good filters, and in the 80s they didn't have the greatest filters, and so they basically.
It's always actually been a failing in Soviet armor. I haven't thought about it before now. The T-34 was famous for Aberdeen Proving Ground was like, oh, these filters are terrible. Interesting.
But yeah, so they if you want to be sent to a really cold place, get yourself qualified on the T-80.
On the other hand, if you get into combat, you're a lot less likely to die. So, choose your poison. Hey, I just want to quickly note, with the photos we've got going in the slide ship, Vitaly Kuzmin I don't know who he is, but he's someone in Russia who takes an enormous number of photos of tanks and makes them available under Creative Commons licensing so we can use them. Everyone uses Vitaly Kuzmin's photos. So I just want to do a quick shout out of thanks to Vitaly Kuzmin. Thanks to everyone whose photos we've used over the course of this podcast. But he's a real standout in Soviet tank photography. So,
yeah, thank you. All right. After the disintegration of the Soviet Union, Russia took the bulk of the T-80s. There was a YouTube channel, Battle Order, has a very good video on all the cold places and the numbers and the types of T-80s spread around Russia prior to them all being, a lot of them being sent to Ukraine. So shout out to them. It was very insightful for me to be able to say, oh, they're over here, they're over there, they're everywhere. And so, and that was, that was a good little system, a good little video to watch. Ukraine had some from the Soviets when they claimed independence. They also had hundreds partially built in the factory at Kharkiv.
These were the ones that did not exist according to the CFE treaty, the Conventional Forces in Europe treaty. And then suddenly it's like, oh, there's hundreds of them. Technically don't exist, but here they are.
So once they were the Soviet Union broke up and the Russians said, well, you can have those ones, but it's the ones in the factory. They said, well, we're just going to take these ones and see what happens with that. And the other one was the 20th Tank Division. And I'm assuming they were a Ukrainian unit. They were stationed in Poland at the fall of the Soviet Union, and in 1993, so sometime later, they drove their 350 T-80s to Ukraine and then left them there. So they got another 350 T-80s just dropped off because I'm assuming the boys said, right, we're home. We're no longer part of the Soviet army. We're going back to whatever else we want to do.
Yeah, look, I mean, just there was a whole lot in that period of, is someone going to give us some money for this stuff? Let's go. Entrepreneurialism. It's amazing how the entrepreneurial spirit thrived in the post-Soviet era.
Oh, not always in a good way though. Yeah.
Alexander has pointed out that a lot of current Ukrainian T-80s were taken from the First Guards Tank Army's defeats in the early part of the Ukraine war.
Then the Ukrainians then took most of those that they had and sold them off to Pakistan, basically because they needed the money. But after the 2014 invasion started, they started pulling off the covers.
Pakistan's got to be feeling good about that. Yeah, India's got all these T-90s that they're going, oh, these things any good at all, but Pakistan's got the T-80s.
After the 2014 invasion of Crimea and Donetsk and Luhansk, Ukraine started pulling the covers off all the mothballed tanks and refurbishing them. They now have lots of ex-Russian T-80s that they found lying around the countryside. Plus
the farmers with their tractors. Yeah.
No, that was ex-Russian. So so they had the ex-Soviets, and now they have the extra ex-Russian ones just lying around the place that somebody. They parked it there and then didn't come back, and so we're just going to claim it. All right, now Cyprus, Greek Cyprus. Sorry, Greek.
Yeah, I was going to say, get your side of Cyprus, right?
All right, was the first to buy 41 T-80s in 1996, and then they bought another 41 in 2010 to counter the Turkish forces. I've done something, John. We'll just have a quick break as Rob's broken. Yeah, that was my fault. I obviously pressed something and I'm not qualified for. Who lets me drink and drive technology? I don't know. All right, as I was saying,
I've got a whole sea of technology in front of me. I've given one thing to Rob to manage.
There's a reason why I just do a lot of talking and drinking. Anyway, so I was wondering. So they've bought. 82 T-80s in all this time to counter the Turkish forces in northern Cyprus. And I was wondering, how does Cyprus pay for these tanks? I mean, it's not a big place and there's not a whole lot there type thing besides tourism.
There's some fishing, there's some offshore oil.
There's offshore oil now. It wasn't back then. Yeah. But then I read about how, it's a tax haven, especially for Russian oligarchs.
Yeah. The one hand giveth, the other hand receiveth.
So obviously they want to protect their mega yachts, and that's why they're making sure that nobody comes in. And even though they're part of, I can't remember their exact relationship with the EU and so forth, but basically, I think they know which side of their bread is buttered.
Well, God, I haven't looked Cyprus up lately, but I believe it's still divided between a Turkish northern Cyprus and a Greek bit.
It is, but the northern side's not recognised as a thing.
Yeah.
So whereas the anyway, so being a tax haven for Russian oligarchs is, I think, their main economy. Yeah, there is oil being found in the sea lanes around them now, but then again, that's all controversial because between Lebanon, Egypt, Turkey, and Greece and them, who gets the money and who gets...
Alexander has noted that the 1st Tank Battalion was paid for entirely from pickpocketing and SIM card scams. Sounds like someone who's been to Cyprus.
All right. Egypt bought 34 from Russia in 1997. Again, just selling them off because they wanted the cash at that point. South Korea. Now, this is where John was talking about.
And this is the Omsk plant just quietly churning them out, even though they've been abandoned by the rest of the Russian state. And it makes you think South Korea, you know, they've operated T-80s, they've operated American tanks, they're building their own now. They've had an unusually good seat for getting the best designs from all over the world and having a really good look at them.
Yeah, so South Korea got 33 from Russia in 1995, well, between 1995 and 1997. And another 2 in 2005. And it was because Russia couldn't pay its debts. And they said, look, we don't have any cash, but would you like a tank? Or 33. And
Well, it's a bit like how the Soviet Navy got sold off to Pepsi.
we don't talk about the Pepsi Navy.
The State Department was going to Pepsi saying, "Why have you're acquiring this enormous fleet?" And they were like, "We're dismantling the Soviet Navy. Don't leave us alone." They were buying it for scrap value, mind you.
Yeah.
But they were taking the Soviet ships for scrap value in payment for Pepsi syrup. Yes.
Yeah. Anyway, so yeah, and this was not a debt from Russia. This was a debt from Soviet times to South Korea. So they said, "Look, we don't have any cash for you," because in the 90s, before Vlad came along and basically cashed them up with oil and gas and stole a lot for himself. This was debts from before 92, and I said, "Look, we can't pay that." Even though somebody's name is on the bill, how about you have some tanks instead? So that's what they've given them off. However, 2016, Vlad said, yes, you know those tanks I gave you before. I would like them back, please. He was, no, he wasn't getting those back.
Yeah, Koreans have a long history of telling the Russians no.
So Vlad did not get his T-80s back in 2016. I mean, thinking, look, it would be really useful to have an extra number of tanks lying around. Oh, now, we won't go to the beer review now.
No, Rob, because let's motor through. I need to wee.
All right. God, we're gonna be a while, baby. All right. So, Uzbekistan has some unknown number. They were probably relocated there after the conventional forces in Europe treaty limited the number of tanks in Europe in 92. And so they were driven over to Uzbekistan and said, "Oh, look,
and in Europe,
we're not in Europe, so this counts." And they got basically taken over after they moved on from there. Yemen bought 31 from Russia in 2000 and 66 from Belarus. No date given, but probably before the civil war started. So, as I said, there are 97 T-80s running around in Yemen. Whether or not they are still working, we don't know.
I mean, Houthis are terrifying just as light infantry. Give them a few tanks, they'll conquer Saudi Arabia in a week.
Cornelius,
hello.
welcome.
And Alexander Hodge has joined us.
Welcome, Alexander.
Yes.
Studying for your course. Well, good luck in that.
Yeah.
I like to study tanks once a month, and that's probably my main thing.
Nothing like a beer.
I hope you get through.
Yeah.
Yes.
The beer tube is drained, so we're just pre-pouring now. Oh, Rob, this is dark.
Yes, that's what's it called, John?
It's called Orion the Dark.
The Dark. The Dark.
Now, it was funny when Rob got here, because it's always a surprise to me what beer Rob's bringing. And people have asked me, "Oh, what beer are you drinking? I'll get some and drink along with you." I'm like, God, can't help you, I don't know. Yes, I was like, "So, Rob, did you go with the cheap? Did you go with South Korean beer?" And he's like, "Oh, I wish I'd thought of that."
Well, I'm wearing a Japanese tank T-shirt, so I got Japanese beer. And this isn't the beer review beer. This is just another beer to be drink, and it is called The Dark. And so it was in my shop, and we haven't looked at it before. So I thought
it's a very white head on it. I mean, it's not the darkest beer, but it's definitely brown beer territory. Yeah.
Anyway, Pakistan bought 320 T-80s from Ukraine. They were delivered between 1997 and 99. They were buying those in order to counter the India buying lots of T-72s and then T-80s from Russia. Ukraine wanted to build more for Pakistan, but Russia said, you can't export our intellectual property, so Ukraine had to redesign stuff and able to sell it on the export market.
And then 2014 rolled around, Ukrainians said, we don't give a crap about your own thing. We ain't friends no more.
Morocco got 5 T-80s in the late 80s for evaluation. Now, that's a funny thing because, again, they weren't provided outside the Soviet Union, and yet Morocco, somehow, the kingdom of Morocco somehow got 80 of them prior to that. So
they must have been promising to spend a lot of money on that.
They do have lots of T-72s and T-90s at the moment. So obviously it's basically they said, we're just seeding the market, as it were. China. There's speculation they probably bought somewhere between 50 and 200 for testing and technology transfer reasons, but it's not officially published anywhere that I could find in my 5 minutes Googling of that sort of information. The UK, famous buyers of Russian tanks, bought one in 1992, saying for $5 million or pounds or whatever. I can't remember what it was.
Pounds, I imagine.
And it was they bought it unofficially, saying it was going to be sent to Morocco. But then they said, "Oh, hang on a second, we're just going to hang on to this. It wasn't actually from Morocco; it's actually for us." And they used it for testing and figuring out what it did and what it was good at. And then they gave it to the U.S. Army.
That would have been a really critical moment in terms of the UK figuring out if they wanted to go with turbine engines. So that evaluation, obviously they could borrow M1s to have a look at, but to get someone else's turbine, and one literally British manufacturing is today worth what it was at the height of the Industrial Revolution, largely because of making satellites and making jet engines. So it's interesting they have never gone down the turbine route, considering that they're one of the great makers of jet engines in the world.
There you go. So they gave theirs after doing a bunch of testing. They gave it to the US for them to test, and it's still sitting in. This is going to crack. Oh, there we go. Running around Aberdeen testing grounds, I believe.
Proving grounds.
Proving grounds. Belarus had at least 95 at the fall of the Soviet Union, but has sold them off or scrapped them over time as they no longer use them, which seems surprising. That
I bet they're regretting that now. Because, as we've been saying, for those who are joining the feed late, the combat experience in Ukraine has shown that the T-80 is the better Russian tank of those available.
All right. Kazakhstan have 4 or 5 for training purposes at their military training school. Greece was looking to buy some, but went for Leopard 2 instead. This is going to be a common theme. Sweden was looking to buy.
That's kind of weird that Greek Cyprus went with T-80 and Greece went with a different tank. I mean, they've got to get their act together. But yeah, go on.
Sweden was looking to buy some in evaluating them as part of a tender in 1993, but went for the Leopard 2 instead. Turkey was looking to buy some, but went for Leopard 2 instead.
Look, if I could buy Leopard 2, I would buy it over T-80 every minute of the day, and mostly not for the the hardware or the iron of the tank, but for the systems and the thermal images. And
then Malaysia was looking to buy some in the noughties, but went for the PT-91 Pendeka instead, which is the Polish T-72 domestic design.
Right.
All right. Now, do you need a break?
Look, I'm thinking
the models will go for a while.
Yeah. Let's. We're going to go to our halftime break now,
right,
which is an interview with Ross Manuel from the I Was Only Doing My Job podcast. So I hope you folks enjoy this, and we will be
about 30 to 35 minutes long. So enjoy that.
But Ross is a wealth of interesting minutiae of Australian military history. Not just minutiae, that's being a little dismissive. Just enjoy the video, and we'll be back to finish up on the T-80 and do some other stuff.
And if for any Sabaton fans out there, you might hear some stories that you've already heard.
So we are joined by Ross Manuel from the I Was Only Doing My Job podcast, part of the Doc Network. Ross, hello.
Hello. It's good to see you. Good to speak to you guys. When I read about your article in the paper, I'm like, another military history podcast in Canberra. I must reach out to you guys.
I'm glad you did, because it's been really enjoyable going through your catalogue of podcasts, and I was only doing my job and seeing the snippets and the deeper dives into some of the Australian stories of soldiers of the past. It was it was very, very useful and enjoyable.
Oh, yeah, and that's the thing. Like, one thing I found when I started this thing was no one was really talking about what we did, on the global stage. Like most of our schooling was, we did Gallipoli and we did Kokoda, but outside the rest of the world, it was Australia has an army. Australia was involved in the First and Second World Wars. So I was like, I've got to do something to fix this.
Out of interest, your podcast audience, what's your geographic spread like?
At the moment, the United States is 59% of my listener base.
Okay.
But which is weird because I'm like, okay. And Ashburn, Virginia is like a pretty big chunk of that group. But previously, it was almost exclusive. I was like 70% Australian. It's only in the last 5 or 6 episodes where the United States has overtaken us.
Oh, nice one. Okay, so you've talked a little bit about your podcast. So it's mostly stories of Australians at war, which is mostly the 20th century, I suppose.
Pretty much. So the main focus of the podcast is essentially from the colonial period up until really Korea. Main reason is I don't go much beyond the Boer War is because the accessibility and reliability of sources starts to become questionable. And anything more recent than Korea, I'm facing the Archives Secrecy Act or the Archives Protection Act, which basically is like, I can't. I'm just some schmuck who does a podcast. I don't have any clearances behind me to be like, hey, can I read these Vietnam or Afghan service records? And they go, no.
Yeah. Well, as a tank podcast, I'm really enjoying your series on the A7V
yes.
and how we didn't steal it, we weren't drunk, and it. I still think
we should have been. Damn it!
Yes, it would have made my job so much easier. Like Mephisto, like debunking Mephisto rumors is literally the cornerstone of my video presence. Just because it's surprising how so few people actually know Mephisto is real, and even fewer know the actual story of how we got it.
Yeah, for the benefit of the audience, can you fill everyone in on the backstory here? Because I don't imagine a significant number of audience know it.
Okay, so Mephisto was one of 22 German A7Vs, heavy tanks. So the A7V was just called that because the 7th Tank Production Bureau developed the tank, which became the German tank that everyone. Well, it's a very obviously different design than the British and French tanks. So essentially, it's a box on treads as opposed to a box of treads around it.
Yeah, and this is World War One.
World War One,
and about 30 tons, I believe.
Yeah, it's about 30 tons with a crew of 22.
22 people. That's amazing.
Yeah, it's insane, and could have a carrying capacity of another 8. And basically, so it and its siblings were participating in the battle to essentially capture Villers-Bretonneux on the 24th of April. But in order to get there, they had to set up just before an area called Monument Wood. They drove into Monument Wood as part of a 3-tank force. A fuel line got clogged in Mephisto, and it fell behind. The crew dismounted, cleared the area around Mephisto, while the engineers repaired the fuel line clog. Then they kept driving forward, ended up driving into a shell crater. The guy's like, the crew's like, well, we can't get this thing out of this thing. We don't have any tank recovery vehicles. We're well behind our line, so we're not really going to worry about it. The crew got out, fought on foot. Eventually, the Germans captured Villers-Bretonneux on the 24th of April. On the 25th of April, the Australians recapture it. And then from the 25th of April up until the middle of July, the Australians are basically recapturing, and the Allies are recapturing all the terrain that we lost during the Spring Offensive. And eventually, we get to the outskirts of Monument Wood. The 28th Battalion enter Monument Wood through a process known as peaceful penetration. Cue the childish giggling, because this is... and then basically they see Mephisto. They make a side of it. They do sketches of the dugout system that's been built around Mephisto because the Germans had been using it as an outpost. because essentially a local marker in the ground. Then they get driven off. The 20th get driven off. They get replaced by the 26th from Brisbane, who then continue the process of recapturing all of Monument Wood and then pushing the line further south. This is an area that hadn't seen the industrialized carnage of the First World War, so there was still green grass and trees everywhere. So this was like the back line of the Allied line previously. So there's no built-up fortifications here. The Australians dig in at the edge of Monument Wood with Mephisto 12 meters behind the German line. And as the 26th Battalion is tasked with being rotated out of the line, because they spend about 2 weeks in the line before they rotate out, the commander of the 26th Battalion sends a line up to General Wisdom, who's the brigade officer, goes, "We have a tank in our line that we captured. Can we claim that as a trophy?" And General Evan Wisdom, who is the commander of the brigade, goes, "Yeah, I'll pass it up the line. Perfectly fine, no problem." The thing is, you guys have to get it out of the front line. It takes 8 days to recover Mephisto, and required help from the 2nd Gun Carrier Company, the Royal Air Force, the Royal Artillery Corps, Royal Engineers, because they're the ones who had experience with dealing with tanks. So the British Army had to come in, reckon onto the area.
Prime movers, yeah.
Big prime movers. They had all the heavy lift equipment, because we had no heavy lift equipment at all in the First World War. And then as we're in the process of hitching massive ass chains to the front of Mephisto to drag it out of the shell crater, the Germans decide that was the time they were going to do a gas raid. Completely separate from the whole affair, because what the British had been doing is at night spraying the German lines with artillery and having aircraft fly overhead at low levels, which they got used to mask the heavy prime movers coming up to retrieve Mephisto. And then eventually what happened is the Germans said, "Oh, this day, it's a perfectly good day to launch a gas raid." So they fired gas shells in the general vicinity of Mephisto, because one of the reasons the 26th said, "Hey, can we remove this from the battlefield?" is the Germans had sighted it as a fixed location. And if you have any experience with artillery, anything that's not above ground is going to be a ranged-in target. Mephisto gets out. They 12 men essentially recover it. They create fake tank tracks going in an opposite direction to confuse German aerial observation. And then they take it to the British tank yard, well behind the yard, for study. This is, at the time, the 2nd A7V that had been captured by the British, or the Allied forces. The French had captured Alfred not long after the Battle of Villers-Bretonneux. So it's sitting on the British tank yard, and all of the brass come to Mephisto and go, "Oh, look at this great thing that one of the Dominions has captured." They're coming in, they're walking around, they're souveniring pieces off it. So, fuel tanks, pilot and driver's seats, all the machine guns are gone by this point. And there's 8 machine guns 4 machine guns and a 2-pounder gun on this thing. They've taken the machine guns, but what they've done and what the 26th Battalion did was to make sure that no one forgot who did it, was they've painted on the side, "Captured by the 26th Battalion." And then salvaged by the 1st Gun Carrier Company. They're making it very, very abundantly clear that Mephisto was captured by the Australians. But in a great, tongue-in-cheek reference, on the front of Mephisto is the Faustian demon Mephistopheles, where Mephisto got her name from, running off with what is presumed a Mark IV tank. So on the side of the hull is a British Imperial Lion standing on an A7V. Which is quite hilarious, but it's purely for the enjoyment of the Allied brass walking around, because there was no way the Germans were going to see this. It gets claimed as a trophy. It goes to the War Trophies Tribunal, and the Australian government, the Australian parties, petition successfully for it to be brought to Australia.
See,
it's loaded aboard the.
The story I heard about that was the British Army said, "No, it's ours. You're just here with us." And so the Australians said, "Well, bugger that. We're just taking it." So I thought that's the story I heard, that we did steal it essentially from the British.
We 100%, because the British had claimed it on the proviso that we couldn't get it back to Australia. We did the same thing with the Amiens railway gun.
I was about to say, we took some big trophies around then, but yeah.
Yes. So the basically what happened was that prior to 1916, there was a general consensus that everything captured by the Dominions was eligible to be shown in the Imperial War Museum or the Queen Victoria Prince Albert Museum in England, and everything else would then be distributed out through the Dominions. obviously the Dominions, not wanting to hear this, went, no, our troops captured it. We should have first pick of it. Which all that basically meant was that we could then arbitrate before this committee of like why we wanted the object, why was it important to us, and why we should have it in Australia. We were successful getting Mephisto and the Amiens railway gun home. The Kiwis were not successful getting the 2 A7Vs they captured sent back to Australia, back to New Zealand, because they couldn't get the shipping to send it there. And both of those were scrapped by and they got scrapped. Both of those got scrapped by 1919. So Mephisto's loaded on the SS Armagh in 1919, and it's shipped back to Australia. But on the way home, they're like, "Where's this thing going anyway?" Because the Commonwealth claimed it, Melbourne claimed it, and then Brisbane claimed it. And the reason why Brisbane claimed it is because the 26th Battalion came from Brisbane. And it basically wasn't until they were like essentially entering the Straits of Lombok where Charles Bean intervened on behalf of the Brisbane authorities and said, well, the 26th Battalion captured it. They can have Mephisto as part of their allocation of the war trophies. But the thing is that no one told the Brisbane authorities this. So it sat for about 6 months on the Brisbane harbour on a wharf until they were like, oh, hang on, this is ours. We can take it off the wharf. And so then they used government steamrollers to drag it through the streets of Brisbane to get to what was the Brisbane Museum. And apparently, I haven't seen this to verify it, there are still buildings on the route that bear the scrape marks of Mephisto dragged along the road. Because unlike in the recovery of Mephisto from Monument Wood, where they oiled the tracks and made sure it could move, they didn't bother with any of that when they got it through.
Sitting out in the sea air for the last 6 months.
I was going to say, by the time it's been deck cargo all the way around the world and then sat on the Brisbane dock, it's not going to turn as smoothly as it did before. Yeah.
So apparently it carved up the road and then basically sat in, on the outside of the old Brisbane Museum, where it was exposed to the elements. It was rained on. People climbed on it. I've heard stories of, people, they're finding food scraps from like the 60s and 70s inside the tank. Then they based one of the historians decided to sandblast the thing, which removed all of the original paint to deal with the rust problem, because what happens when you leave a 30-ton steel vehicle outside is it rusts. Then the 2008, I think it was 2008, Brisbane floods happen. And Mephisto's covered in mud up to the bottom, the tops of her wheel treads. And that's basically what they're like, oh, we should probably stop leaving this thing outside because it's now going to deteriorate. An agreement was reached somehow between the Brisbane Museum and the Australian War Memorial, where it was taken down to Canberra. It was restored there. It went on display in Anzac Hall, which I saw. That's where I saw it. And standing in front of it, I think it's terrifying standing in front of it. While the Brisbane Museum built a whole new display for it. And all while this happened, online, articles started appearing of Mephisto being talked about and the history of Mephisto being coming out. So it ended up being this pop culture phenomenon on par with the Emu War of how did Australians...
No, hang on. Nothing's on par with the Emu War.
True. Except for most of my listener base. It ended up with all these stories of like, how did the only surviving German First World War tank, because we didn't realize until, which is ironic, that, for the 70 years, we had the only First World War German tank. How did it get to Australia in the first place? And of course, the natural reaction is we were drunk, and that's why we took it. Because, we're only one generation removed from our convict past. And the idea of, dallying forth and stealing from a bunch of hapless Germans is what we do. We're not all John Barney Hines. And that's basically what's propagated.
I'll get onto him later, but yeah.
Just continually propagated this story that we were drunk in the trenches forever, we were bored, and we saw this tank sitting in no man's land, and we're like, hey, Jono, you reckon we can take that?
Of course we could.
But anyone who's been anywhere near a tank, and you guys have been near tanks, you're like, they're not exactly quiet. No one's not going to not know that something's moved.
As we've discussed a few times, the best way to steal a tank is to overrun its depot. But let's move on a touch from Mephisto. Have you done any other tank related episodes yet?
Not yet, mainly because, as you know, I did a couple. Sorry, I did I did actually do the one of the original founders of the tank brigade, Major General Robert Harold Nimmo. He was one of the original architects behind Australian armored doctrine. He was a light horseman during the First World War. He then transitioned from light horseman to cavalry by going motorized, and then he became the nominal commander of the 1st Armored Brigade when it was a militia unit. And then before he went to Darwin Command, he was briefly one of the chief designers in the tactics of the famed Australian tank brigades, which we don't talk about. But he was in charge of that. And then he went on to become the greatest peacekeeper the world's ever produced.
One of the other ones I wanted to ask about was Bull Allen and the connection with Sabaton.
Yes.
Now, I want to hear this story.
Okay, so the reason why the podcast exists is because during lockdown, like everyone else, I downloaded TikTok, and there was a lot of people who were doing history, mainly Americans and Brits doing military history content, things like that. And occasionally an Australian will come up, and they'll mention something about Australian, and I'll comment on that. And eventually kept going until my boss actually sent me a rules like, when we return to work, can you write up? Can we, as it gives us all jobs to do, can we write up a delivery, a presentation to give to the crowds when we return to work? Not realizing that, when Canberra returned from the first lockdown, public gatherings weren't allowed still. I did someone who is included in all of this promotional material, and the only Australian that Sabaton has made a song about, being Leslie Bull Allen, this giant of a man who gained the moniker because he just charged down his opponents playing AFL, and he's like 5'10". He's a massive unit of a guy, and which is where he gets the name Bull Allen. And it was actually rather depressing reading his story when I put it together. Is that he didn't speak at all of his experiences, but he was so beloved by the men that he served with, and in particular the Americans that he rescued, that his children didn't know what he did until they saw the letters from Eleanor Roosevelt. But essentially, Leslie Bull Allen, so the first episode that I did back in July 2021, he joins the Second Australian Imperial Force. He's from a family broken by domestic violence. He's adopted by his aunt. He's basically working as a labourer to support his sister, who's going to studying to be a nurse. Joins the Second Australian Imperial Force as a stretcher bearer, and he goes to North Africa, and he gets all this acclaim because he stays up all night with his wounded brothers, and then makes this 20-kilometer long journey from where they are in Syria to get transport for the wounded to bring them back to recover them. And then he's affected by this. I know he's almost affected by PTSD almost immediately. So he goes to the hospital for war neurosis. He returns just in time for the unit to return to Australia. He has a brief period of leave, and then he goes into New Guinea as part of the New Guinea campaign. And then what happens is, while there, he gets he again shows his brave courage as a giant man. He goes off into battle, and he basically just fireman carries wounded men. Like, he goes into an area that's been ambushed by Japanese soldiers. The platoon commander is killed. The sergeant is heavily wounded. Bull Allen is not involved in this operation. He goes in, he brings the wounded back. The media reports it over 100 yards. But they refer to him as this Herculean effort, and for that he receives the military medal. Then we come to the part where he is enshrined in history with Sabaton, which is the Battle of Mount Tambu. So prior to what happened, that battle is the Australians and the Americans, both of the Americans are even involved. The Australians are attacking Mount Tambu, which is this strategic point on the coast, not far from the coast. And the Japanese are taking the top of the mountain, and the Australians have to basically kick them off the mountain. They try about 8 times to try and dislodge the Japanese, taking heavy casualties in the process. by that point, the Americans have landed, and they have gone and they said, okay, we're going to take over. We'll do the operation now instead. And Australians, you're no longer required. You can set up a support position instead. And basically what happens is...
He's been involved in recovering the Australians at that point as well.
Yeah, he's been recovering Australians as well. So he and some mortar battery units, they elect to stay behind because the Americans are like, well, we need some support. We need some locals who understand the terrain. So we've got some mortar crews and some stretcher bearers who have elected to stay behind. One of these is Leslie Allen. And as he's standing, not engaged in the battlefront, the Australians haven't been invited to participate in the battle. They're observing at this point. Bull Allen watches as a succession of American medics are just gunned down by the Japanese. The Americans are getting wounded up the slopes of Mount Tambu. They're calling for the medic. The medic's coming up. The medic's being killed. Medic's either being killed by shrapnel or sniper or machine gun fire, whatever it is. And then something clicks in Leslie Allen, and I've never been able to figure out why, because he's never spoken about the whys he did any of it. He just strolls off into the battle. It's one of those classic. The official war photographer who was there said this giant strolled as if it was on a Sunday jaunt, strolls into the battlefront, picks up an American soldier, and then brings him back to the friendly lines. And then turns around.
It's not like a Sunday jaunt, and that it's not covered in mud, not up and down a hill through a jungle. It's doing all of those and carrying somebody on his back.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And all being shot at. Now, his uniform's been cut to shreds. This is the second time this has happened to him. His haversack's been cut out. His haversack's bullet ridden. His hat's bullet ridden. His pants, his shirt's bullet ridden. And then he turns around and goes back. And then does it again and again and again. Now, reporting is a little bit wishy-washy on how many. So it's anywhere between 8 and 14 Americans end up being rescued by Bull Allen, to the point where even like the guys who are who are in the reserve line that he's moving through are taking bets on whether or not he's going to come back, because they see him and he drops one off and walks up, goes back, goes to the other guy. I've often pictured it very much like the scene from Forrest Gump, where the whole unit is there. It's like, I got to find Bubba. He goes in, finds someone else, brings them back, goes out, grabs another person.
I do wonder I do wonder how he got immortalized in Sabaton, in a Sabaton song.
I was going to ask that myself.
Well, what happened was, so he ends up getting the US Silver Star, and the official thing is he saved 10. That's the official record. And this action horribly affects him. He strikes an officer, and he's medically discharged on account of recurring bouts of malaria. So basically, what I suspect has happened is that the officers are like, I know the war's affected you. I'm not gonna put you up on charges for striking me, but you're not well, and malaria. Because after this encounter, he becomes mute, and he doesn't speak until after the war. But what he does do is he gets letters from Eleanor Roosevelt, so the wife of the then president of the United States, FDR, who continues well up until her death. And so much so that, his daughter is called Eleanor in her honor. But the thing is that he never talks about what he did. Whatever you see any articles about when he was interviewed, he's always deflecting attention to other stretcher bearers. And this is where the title of the podcast comes from. He routinely would just say, I was only doing my job. And he's like, I was only doing my job. And then he goes, in America, he's a folk hero. All the Americans, obviously, he's rescued, and all the Americans that have seen him do this are talking about, have you seen this Aussie who comes in? He just walked in like the bullets didn't mean anything. He picked up the wounded guys and just over his shoulder like a sack of flour, then walked straight back out. So he's a folk hero in the United States. In Australia, he says that his children have no idea what he did during the war until they find his letters or the people that he rescued sent to speak to them. He gets offers in Hollywood to immortalize his actions in film, and he's like, no, I was just a man doing my job. Other men are more worthy of this task. He ends up, working the silver mine, working the mill at Sovereign Hill, which is a reenactment what is it? How would you call it? How would you describe Sovereign Hill to a non-Australian? It's a reenactment village from like the colonial period.
Colonial reenactment, yeah.
Colonial reenactment village. He works there until he dies as a from complications from diabetes. But up until his death, he proudly carried the banner of the Second Tenth for the duration of his life in Melbourne or in Ballarat where he grew up.
So the Anzac Day parades, he would carry their banner. Yeah.
Yeah. So the Anzac Day, he would make the habit, and the people like keep seeing him, and and I've seen video of him later in his life, and he's from Anzac Day, and he's so proud of what he's done, but his face is so haunted by it as well. And I suspect why did Sabaton pick this one Australian from Ballarat as the focus in the Heroes album? And I have to think it's because if he was this giant braved the odds, at least a dozen times when other men would have died. And as they say in the story, sometimes war is killing, sometimes it's saving lives. And like he did all this stuff without ever firing a shot. Then you look at it, you go like, well, should he have gotten the Victoria Cross? And I'm like, yes, he probably should have. But at the time, the Australian forces were relying on an interpretation of the criteria, which meant you had to be an active participant in the battle to get the Victoria Cross.
Because the Australians weren't participating.
Yes.
It doesn't count.
Yes.
I mean, it's a big can of worms, all the various criteria for why people can and can't get VCs. It's possibly this. You could just about do a whole podcast series on that can of worms.
Yeah. I mean, and the irony is though, it's like if he was American, he would have gotten the Congressional Medal of Honor.
Yeah, right.
I mean, without a doubt. I mean, I'm fairly certain MacArthur would have recommended it.
For those who don't know, the US Silver Star is the highest award they can provide to a non-American soldier. So
yes.
Is that correct? Yeah.
Yes. So the US Silver Star has been awarded 16 times. No, hang on. I think I've written it down. It's been awarded to Australia. Like Australia's received a lot of Silver Stars, surprisingly. It's mainly in the two world wars. It's
a couple in Vietnam, weren't there?
A couple in Vietnam. So the two of the four Victoria Cross recipients from Vietnam received the US Silver Star. Then there is on top of that, it's about 8 overall, like 4 from the First World War, 4 from the Second World War. I'm not exactly, don't quite exactly quote me on that. But yeah, Peter Adco, VC recipient, Harry Harcourt, VC recipient, Ray Simpson, VC recipient. So it's usually on the lines of these guys who receive it are often receive other equivalent or higher awards as well. Keith Payne, all 4 of the Victoria Cross recipients of Vietnam received the US Silver Star. It's not something that the US give out lightly. I mean, I just looked at the foreign recipients. 22 of them have been awarded to non-Americans, and Australia is probably the parity on the number awarded.
We are good foot soldiers for the Empire. Yeah.
Yes.
All right. Look, we're going to probably have to wind this up in a sec. Rob, sorry, did you have a question there?
No, I was just about to say the same thing.
Okay. Ross, tell our audience where they can find your stuff if they want more intense Australian military detail.
So the podcast is called I Was Only Doing My Job, an Australian military history podcast. It is found on literally everything. If it is on a podcast platform, I will soon find it and put it on there. I am found on podcast is found on TikTok. It is found on Instagram. It's found on YouTube. It is found on Facebook at IWODMJ, or is X now, whatever. I'm on Mastodon. I'm on Doc Winters, which is where you want to find my videos on things. But everything we found at thedocnetwork.net.
Brilliant. Okay. Ross, it's been an absolute delight. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us and our audience. And I'm sure we will be talking to you again in the future.
Yes, I didn't even get a chance to talk about my 2 favorite tanks.
Oh, okay. Hit us up. Give us your 2 favorite tanks.
Wait, next time. Okay,
Oh,
so
okay.
because when we first started interacting, one of the questions was, "Oh, we could discuss our two favorite tanks." And I was like, "Well, okay, the two favorite tanks I have is the Locust and the Wolverine."
Okay, so the Locust was the is almost like the Tetrarch. It was designed to be a paradrop tank, right?
It was the US built M26 Locust. When you look at the thing, it's about 5 foot tall. When it compared to a Sherman, it looks like it was designed for a child. I just love the novelty of it, like the fact that the British are like, we want something better than the Tetrarch, but we are restricted by the fact that it has to be carried in a hammer car glider. And we're like, okay, we'll give you the Locust. It's used once during the Second World War, during Operation Varsity, of which almost none of them survive. The ones that do, they managed to achieve the objective, so they do actually do better than the Tetrarch did. But they're also spouting a 37mm gun. And this is in 1945. So, but for an infantry support vehicle, it's a great
a tank, but it'll knock over a half track, and that's
exactly in 1945. It's not bad for what it does. I always like the novelty of it.
The point being,
without wanting to drag this on
paratroop
too long.
operations. Okay. I was going to say, the point being for paratroop operations, you want to be dropping in the back lines where you shouldn't be facing tanks anyway. You'd be facing logistics vehicles and soft skin stuff.
Exactly. So if like for it did, I always love the idea of it because this how small it is compared to the main battle, like the main battle tanks that the Allies were producing. So it's a design compared to it looks like a little Tykes car, and the other one is the Wolverine, so the M10. The reason why I've always been a fan of the M10 was I got into World War II wargaming, tabletop wargaming, and my tank option, I know, was due to the store I was at, had an M10, and I went googling the M10, and I found a photo of one M10 surrounded in a sea of 76mm shell casings. And I just love that tank because it's one of those ones that it scored a kill off a Tiger, and it was like, but how does but the reason why I did it was because it damaged the turret. Now this is anecdotal. Apparently, it rammed the Tiger to the point where it damaged the gun, and then the crew had abandoned. And that's how they claimed the kill on the Tiger. And I always love that story. Like, whether it's true or not, I don't really care, but I always love the fact that this thing was this stopgap vehicle.
It's a bit like the Greyhound story that I mean, pretty much every Sturm or Panzer IV on the Western Front was claimed as a Tiger.
Became a Tiger.
But then again, that's the same. That's the same claim like the Wirraway that used to be at the Stone War. It's now in storage.
Yeah.
Claimed to shut down a Zero, and I was like, sure. Most likely, it probably was a Nakajima. It probably wasn't a Zero, but
No, it was
doesn't really.
But
That's okay. I still love the award there for the part though. US gave him a US Silver Star.
and
Australian Command got him six bottles of beer.
And if you're in Papua New Guinea, the 6-pack of beer means a lot more than a Silver Star at the moment.
Yes, it does.
Okay. Right, we're going to wind this up now, but Ross, thank you very much. We really appreciate it. And like I said, don't be a stranger. I'm sure we'll figure out something else to work on in the future.
100%. Thanks for having me on, guys. This has been a real pleasure.
Good night.
Good night.
And we are back. Hello,
Hello.
folks. I hope you enjoyed that chat. Ross is we will definitely be getting Ross back for some more talks in the future because he is an amazing talent.
Especially on Australian military history. And as for those who aren't Sabaton listeners, you should go out and just have a quick listen to their the Ballad of the Bull.
Yes.
And
I've got that in the slideshow for the second half. T-80s, Rob. T-80s.
T-80s, all right. Models of T-80s, all right. The first model of the T-80 was the T-80. 60 prototype tanks were built in 1976. They quickly said, yeah, these aren't very as good as we would like them to be, except for the engine, which we really like. And then they moved on to the T-80B, which in 1978, which was the first upgraded version. They introduced the ability to fire anti-tank guided missiles down the barrel with the Cobra, and it gave it some better armor.
I just want to quickly say hi to Mehdi. Good to see you in the chat. Yes,
Welcome to the second half of the show, my friend.
All right. Then from 1980, they upgraded in the T-80B, they upgraded to the 1100 horsepower engine. The T-80BK is also there, which is K stands for the command version. Command had more radios, obviously, but however lacked the ATGMs. Was otherwise the same. The T-80A, so we've gone to the B, now we're going to the A, was in 1982, which is much heavier, and they put on the reflex or invar ATGMs, and produced another better engine, producing 1200 horsepower, and they increased the ammo capacity from 36 to 45. However, it didn't go past the prototype, and instead had features that they then incorporated into the T-80U. But before we get to the T-80U, we go to the T-80BV, which is in 1985. And
there's a lot of Russian backronyms in here, so don't worry about the letters. I stopped worrying about the letters a long time ago.
for the rivet counters, though, these things are important, all right?
Yeah, we're going to get to rivet counters.
Right.
Dear. Yeah, we're going to get to you.
So then we get to the T-80BV in 1985, where they applied Contact 1 explosive reactive armor.
That's contact with a K, though.
Yeah.
Contact.
Then there was the T-80BVK, again, command version, still with the 1100 horsepower engine. Then the T-80U, which was in 1987. The U stands for improved. They got an improved turret.
I mean, of course the U stands for improved. Why not?
Upgrade.
Upgrade. Yeah.
Unless it's in Russian or whatever. They got a new turret, 1250 horsepower engine, Contact 5 ERA, reflex and new SVIR ATGMs. And look, there's a bunch of ATGMs running around. I can't remember all of them. The newly built...
Sorry, anti-tank guided missile.
No. But there was reflex...
Yeah, sorry. I'm just... You keep using ATGM, and I'm just letting people know what the acronym means.
I have said it a few times.
Yeah.
Anyway, these were the T-80Us were newly built tanks and not updated existing hulls. So it also provided a night sight for the gunner, and armored side skirts. So where the T-80 previously had rubber side skirts down the side of the road wheels, they provided the first 3 side skirts were now armored, and the driver's seat was off the floor for anti-mine survivability.
It's funny because, I mean, the Hetzer, I think, was the first tank where they suspended the crew positions, tankish, from the ceiling, and it's just become, people have realized it's a very simple thing you can do to suspend the
seat,
the seat from the ceiling, and then whatever's happening underneath the vehicle is not transferring into the spine of the operator.
And all feet.
Yeah.
They also
feet they don't mind, but spines are serious.
All right. They also provided the T-80U also provided the first auxiliary power unit, so you can turn the engine off.
The lessons of Grozny.
No, this is before Grozny. So
right.
So I mean, these are still the and at the end of the 80s, as I was saying before, this was probably one of the best tanks in the world at that time because it had night fighting capabilities. It had the speed, the weapons, and the communications to be able to do lots of stuff. So it was. At the end of the Cold War, it was one of the better tanks in the world. I mean, the Challenger ones were around, but and the Abrams still hadn't got all its upgrades yet. It was still running around without a lot of stuff.
Just quickly for Mehdi, who's joined us in the chat recently. Part of the reason why we're doing this episode is because the T-80 has been returned to production because it has done so very well in the Ukraine war, despite being discarded after the Battle of Grozny as a inadequate tank. So it's fascinating how real combat has totally changed the Russian perspective on this vehicle.
All right, then we get to the T-80 UK with the 1987 command version of the T-80U. It got GPS, or the Russian equivalent of GPS, because they couldn't use the global positioning satellites. They had their own satellites.
I haven't seen it in a Russian tank, but I've definitely seen Russian Su-27s with a Android phone gaffer taped into the cockpit. to give them GPS.
Well, we'll get to that later on. So, again, being command version, it's got more radius. It also got the shorter soft kill system, so the red eyes of death.
which don't work against any modern weapon, but yeah,
Yeah,
move on.
that was 1987. All right, just remember 1987. All right, the T-80 M stands for modernized, and that was 1995, and that's when they've added the arena hard kill active protective system.
Again, a system that has never been demonstrated to work, but yes.
And they provided a thermal image for, sight for the gunner.
The very basics of modern tanks.
That was 1995. Not
Yeah,
a lot of other tanks
no, true.
had those for their crew at that
No,
stage.
it's worth. It always bears repeating that thermal images are in 2023 probably more important than the engine or the armor.
Yeah, you want your radios and your thermal images. The two things you want to be able to do well. In fact, you could be without a tank and just have a good thermal imager and a radio, and you can probably kill a lot of stuff.
As they say, the most dangerous man on the battlefield has a map and a radio and knows how to use them. Yeah.
Nowadays, he needs a thermal imager as well. Then we get to the T-80 UM-1 called the bars, and that was 1997. That had lots of ERA and lots of arena active protective systems.
So explosive reactive armor and a active protection system.
So I think as they layered it, so where previously they had one or the other, and there was gaps and everything else. This one they just slapped it all over the place on this tank. Then you have the T-80 UM-2. There was one experimental tank built with the Drozd hard kill active protective system back in the 90s, and that was killed by Ukraine last year.
Now, I just want to note that when we think of APS now, we think of radars, vectoring, shotgun-like things onto targets. And these 90s era APSs were more about an electronic warfare response or popping smoke or it wasn't the level of trophy. If it says hard kill, then it means it was firing something. But
shotgun rounds out and killing all the infantry around it.
Yeah. I need you to get me a beer, Rob.
Oh yes. Well, shall we? Which?
Oh, you tell me. Oh, this might be time for
beer review.
Do you need me to find a bottle opener?
Yes.
Jesus, it's lucky I'm a man of means who carries the bottle opener.
I know. Well, I have a cultural expectation that you will. Anyway, I'll keep going with the models.
You keep talking the models.
We got plenty more models to go. All right, then we get to the T-80UE in 1999. Which is the Russian export model of the T-80U. However, nobody bought it, so they didn't export it. Then you have the T-80UE-1, which is not the export version. However, it's a different version of the T-80U with whereby they marry up different turrets with different hulls of different versions. So who knows what kind of hodgepodge that is.
And if you're wondering why our very tank knowledgeable audience couldn't spot a T-80 silhouette, it's because these variants just go crazy.
All right, then we get to the Black Eagle Baroness, for anybody who remembers Dungeons and Dragons. The Black Eagle, there were two mock-ups of the Object 640 Black Eagle tank built based on the T-80U hull. It had a 125mm gun with autoloader, with the possibility they could fit a 152mm gun into it. So just in case you wanted bigger guns. It had Cactus ERA, which is totally different from every other...
Cactus with a K.
Cactus with a K. Every other...
You're not serious till you got the K.
Totally different from every other ERA that we've seen, heard, or talked about. It had the Arena Active Protector System. It had a longer hull with 7 road wheels. The main distinction was the turret bustle. It was designed so that all the propellant was stored in the turret bustle with the blowout panels, and most of the projectiles were then stored in the turret. So
what year was this tank, sorry?
It started in the 90s.
Yeah, right.
And they looked at it said it was too expensive. Then they cancelled it. Then they uncancelled it. Then basically they cancelled it about 3 times in 2002, 2007, and 2011.
It's just interesting that they're already at this point anticipating the problems that the Ukraine war have really made everyone pay attention to. So they were already there in their thinking. They just couldn't justify the spending.
Yes. So the main, as I was saying, the main distinction was that the turret bustle designed so that all the propellant was stored in the turret bustle with blowout panels, and the projectiles, the actual rounds themselves, were stored in the turret. So as the autoloader was built so that it could basically marry up the two of them successfully and keep the turret secure and safe. And so if any, rather than blowing off the top of the tank, as with most of the Russian tanks, it basically would just blow out the back, and because the rounds don't really explode all that much. It also
no, it's the propellant that kills people.
Yeah. It also allowed for a longer penetrators, the APFSDS rounds. And
My second favorite acronym. Catabar is my favorite, but APFSDS is the
anyway. So they had longer penetrators and basically shoot through more armor. However, it was way too expensive, and so they said, "Yeah, no, we're not going to go." So they've showed it off a lot. They're still showing off a lot, but they're not going anywhere with them. Then they went on to the T-80 BVM. Now, the BVM. So since 2017, Russia has been taking T-80Bs. Now, this is the tanks built in 1978. They've been taking them out of storage and upgrading them to the BVM. So they've delivered about 300 so far, with more coming, and they're trying to make it compatible with the T-90s. So the gun and the ammo and the ARA are all the same fixtures and fittings, and in order to reduce the logistic stress of the of supplying these things. They've also provided a new thermal sight for the gunner, but not the commander. So the commander's got override capabilities on the gunner, but doesn't have his own thermal sight, blah, 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 blah. And basically
modern tank design, the commander needs to have the full suite of spotting abilities to be designating the next target to be engaged after the Gardner has serviced.
He can do that, but he doesn't.
Can't without a thermal, though.
He can look through the... he has the ability to look through the gunner's thermal sight.
No, that's no good. He needs to be off over the side.
It's not... But just remember, it's
what they call hunter-killer in a way that's a bit confusing. But hunter-killer means that the commander can be pipping, saying, go for this one next, while the gunner's still over there shooting at the last one.
Yeah. And it's got new radios, new fire control. However, it's still got the old turret, still got manual transmission. It's got no active protective system. It is optional to fit onto it, but again, these tanks
fitted for, not with.
Yep.
Yeah.
Oh, for those who don't know, it's a very famous Navy saying. Whereby, so they've taken these tanks that were mothballed 40 years ago, and they're basically rebuilding them and upgrading them, but they're not... The tanks that are built 25 years ago are a better standard to build off, but they're already in service and they're already actually going out and fighting wars. So that's why they've taken the ones out of mothballs and to saying, look, let's whack a thermal sight on them and see how they go. But yeah, it's still not enough. So they've got no inbuilt GPS. That's why you've got your Android phone sitting in the corner telling you where you are. However, they are getting slat armor and cope cages installed as standard. So as they
Can I just say, everyone mocked cope cages when the Russians put them on.
We mocked cope cages.
We did, but the Israelis are putting them on their Merkavas now. So if you've got an enemy that's got drones, you want a cope cage just to stop those little grenades getting in your hatches.
All right. Ukraine is also taking captured Russian T-80s of any version and upgrading them to their standards with thermal images, fire control systems, based on what they've been doing with their T-64s. So again, they might have captured a number of T-80s, John. I don't know the numbers. In fact, I probably read the numbers somewhere. I didn't write them down, sorry. But yeah, there are lots of them. Now, talking about the Ukrainians, this is where we get into the T-80UD.
D for diesel.
D for diesel. So this is because the gas turbines, due to issues with not good with dust, heat, altitude, and the engine service life and fuel consumption, the gas turbine was not acceptable to everybody. So a diesel version of the engine was developed at the Kharkiv tank factory. It was they started out providing 1,000 horsepower. However, that lacked the torque and power of the gas turbine. So they've also developed a 1,250 horsepower diesel engine to go with it. So they're trying to retrofit as many of those as they can. And the T-84. So the T-84 was and we'll very quickly touch on these because
it's a modern version of the UD.
Yeah. So Ukraine built from 1994. Ukraine built the T-80 UD. It entered Ukrainian service in 1999. It was mainly geared for export due to financial issues, but they didn't get it they didn't get any buyers. So finally, the Ukrainian government bought 10 of these tanks for its own army.
10?
10, yes. 10 whole T-80 UDs for its own army. However, due to financial reasons, they had to sell off 4 of them to the US to pay their debts. And that's where we get into and we won't really touch on the oplot. Now we get into the variants.
Oh, the variants, Rob. Okay.
Yes. You wanted the variants. We all want the variants. Okay, so you got the BREM, which is the armored recovery vehicle based on the T-80U.
Very important. With
a large superstructure on the forward hull, half of the chassis, a square section 18-ton crane on the left side, and a 35-ton winch. Which had lighter.
Which is funny because 18 tons and 35 tons is both not enough to move a 50-ton tank.
Well, the crane is in order to be able to pull things out of the tank,
sure,
and or lift off the turret type stuff.
Okay,
and so you can get into the gubbins inside.
Sure.
Now I can tell stories about how when working on a Leopard, we had 2 4-ton cranes, but we needed an 8-ton crane. So we said, look.
2 4-ton trains will do.
And I got in a bit of trouble when I took a photo of that and published it. Because, well, we needed to get the job done. Anyway.
People have been killed by crane collapses. But
yes.
Anyway.
It was nobody was standing anywhere in or near, but yeah. Anyway. So, and then we got the BTU 80 dozer vehicle based on the T-80, so it's got a nice big dozer blade. The MTU 80 bridge layer based on the T-80 chassis. The PTS-4 amphibious load carrier based on the T-80. So again, it's water soluble, across water, I guess. Now, this is my fun one. The Ladoga. It was initially called Debut, and this APC was designed for the evacuation of the Soviet government from under the Kremlin to the airport under nuclear, biological, and chemical attacks. So,
okay, well, this is things that every government has some plans for. And,
the Ladoga uses tracks from the T-80 as well as the suspension system and gas turbine and power plant. The crew has 2 soldiers. It has a 4-seat cab equipped with crew life support facilities to protect the passengers against radiological, chemical, and bacteriological and nuclear attacks. So, yeah.
I wouldn't be surprised if Australia didn't have a modified M113 parked in Parliament House.
No, you just go with a Land Cruiser. You do it with a Land Cruiser.
Anyway, I'm just saying, every country has some of these things. It
was always fun watching. We had up in Darwin back in my day. We had a shed full of Nissan Patrols that every 6 months some hairy fellas from Perth would come out and service. And
Swanbourne Barracks?
Yeah, maybe. They had lots of beards and
they put weird little masks on if there were any TV cameras around.
No. I mean, being the maintenance area, and we never touched these vehicles because somebody else would come along and look after them. There's these 6 vehicles that happen to hang around in.
Every country has funny little assets that sit in funny little places to do jobs when things go badly wrong.
Then we got the BRM BREM 84, which is the Ukrainian version of the ARV, based on the T-80 UD, but powered by the diesel engine of the T-84. And lastly, we've got the 2S19 Mr. S, which is the 152 millimeter self-propelled gun with the T-80 running gear and the T-72 diesel engine, because it was more robust to hang out to deal the use of the running gear.
Well, I mean, self-propelled artillery, it's got a very different use case.
And there's also a NATO standard 155 barrel version for the Ukrainians.
Oh, okay.
Now,
how's the poll going?
that is all we have to say for the moment about the T-80. Now, in just a second, I'm going to crack open this beer, and then we're going to talk about beer.
So at the moment, the poll is running 56% saying the T-80 is good and 44% saying the T-80 is bad. So that's interesting datum. That's off 16 votes. So thanks, folks. And anyone who hasn't voted yet, give it a go. Okay, Rob is manhandling the beer there. It's that's fine too. Okay, so we are done with that half of the show. We're going to change the slides, Rob.
And we're going to drink some beer. So, John, have you read what beer we are drinking right now? This is not the Orion, the Dark. This is...
No, it's an Echigo, which is, I think, an Okinawan brewery. But it's got a beautiful label with Japanese brush printing on it. I don't know if anyone can see that, but we'll give it a go. It's a nice lager. I mean, all Okinawan beer is nice lager. That's what they do. And
rice lager.
I was about to say they put a lot of rice into it. And the thing with Echigo beers or Okinawan lagers, or even, all North Asian lagers, is on a hot summer's day, they are delightful. And, it's extremely clear. It's very light, very, very, very light. I would highly recommend it for a summer's day.
There you go. Being a very warm day in Canberra today, but unlike the
it's lovely and cool here in the basement.
It is. We are in the basement. Anyway, it's smooth.
Although the coolness of the basement is because we've got a heat pump hot water system, and it's sucking the heat out of the basement to make the water hot. This is high efficiency electricity stuff for folks watching. Yeah.
No. Smooth, dry, and crisp, premium quality rice lager, 5%, 500ml bottle, product of Japan. Echigo beer has been well recognized as the first and leading Japanese craft beer branded since its birth in 1994.
I was going to say Echigo is not craft, but
Koshi Harigo Ichigo beer is an extraordinarily smooth lager that's light-bodied, soft, honeyed, and toasty. Hop bitterness is restrained and balanced with a mellow, malty flavor. There you go. And it's in a brown bottle, John.
Yeah, no, brown bottle's good. It's a beautiful bottle. You look quite classy if you had one of those in your hand.
I was about to say, it's mainly for the depiction of...
People think you're necking sake.
But the depiction on the bottle itself of people working in a rice paddy and with
paintbrush. Yeah.
Well, Japanese lettering on the bottle says "You are classy." So there you go, folks.
It's good. I recommend it.
Tastes nice.
We occasionally get criticism of the scope of the beers we review, and yes, it's a lager. It's a lager. It's a lager. It's a lager. Although I would hasten to note, and I'm someone who spent 4 years of my life working in a craft brewery, that 80% of the beer that's drunk in the world is lager. So lager has its place, and Lord knows I still drink a lot of it. There we go.
Alrighty, John. Supposedly we're the worst podcast in the Australian language.
In the Australian language? I didn't know there was an Australian language, Rob.
Mate, I speak Strine and I speak foreign.
Well, Strine is not what we've been accused of. So some dude called Sid Dickhead. That's probably a little... Anyway, let's go with that.
Angus is listening. Angus is listening.
No, Angus is gone. Anyway, Sam something has
Is he Strine?
he's Strine,
Right.
he's got more followers on Instagram than we do because we don't do Instagram. Yes, he's a big swinging thing in the modeling community.
Right.
God save us from the rivet counters.
What's he like in MMA?
Well, I was going to say, look, we'll put our friend MF Goose. We have a fan of the podcast who's gone so far as to tweet that we're the only podcast worth listening to, who is a terrifying MMA fighter, and there's footage of him in front of like thousands of people, just
Love your work.
belting people.
Love your work.
Yeah, so we we respect you. Anyway, so Mr. Dwyer thinks we're the worst podcast in the Australian language, and I always thought we were an English language podcast, but
No, we speak Strine.
yeah, well, we don't speak Australian language. I don't even know what that is. Anyway, yeah, that dude. There's a T-shirt on Redbubble. If you want to buy it, take a photo with it, saying Sam Dwyer says no, and it's in the slideshow at the moment for those on
Listening to us.
Yes. All right, so on to Ukraine, which is depressing as it has been since the Kharkiv breakout.
Yep.
But because of the whole thing going on with Israel and Palestine, the US is basically saying, holy crap, we can't produce enough munitions to supply Israel, so Ukraine's not getting any more from us. And they've also, all the intelligence analysts that made Ukraine look like superstars by making sure they had the best information at any moment are all working on the Israel issue right now. So Ukraine's been told, just make some sort of peace, give it a go. Tough for Ukraine. Would have been nice if after the Kharkiv breakout they'd been given the opportunity to make a deal with Russia then, before 100,000 young men got their legs blown off. That is a crime that boggles the mind, but let's just glide past that. Yes, the US is now acknowledging that Ukraine can't win the war. The West was able to give Ukraine 160 tanks in the last 12 months, and the Russians have been able to put another 500 tanks into service. And that math is not going to get better.
It was more the people.
The people are big, but the hard. I mean, Russia's got more people than Ukraine, and if it's got more hardware coming in, and if it doesn't have the Western intelligence,
and they've also got a million 155 rounds coming in from North Korea per month, whereas the European Union hasn't provided the million rounds of 155 artillery that they've promised from the beginning of the year, and North Korea is doing it every month at the moment.
Yeah, and the big issue is that of the promised ammunition from Europe to Ukraine, only a third has been delivered. Yeah. So the manufacturing capacity of the West is being found wanting, and Israel is going to get. Israel has priority. Ukraine is now the second tier war, and Ukraine is going to need to make a peace. And that I'm sad about that. But
I disagree. I think it'll still keep going, and I'm enjoying the.
How many young men's legs do you want to get blown off to do nothing?
Well, they're making now the Dnieper River and the
there's been a crossing.
Yeah, there's been a number of crossings, and rivers should be seen as a strategic opportunity, even if it's a tactical barrier. So
it's like the river is a highway, the ocean is a highway as much as it is a barrier.
It's more the river is a case of depending on how long the range of the enemy's artillery and missiles are, you can do a lot of work behind that river and have a lot of tactical flexibility, but when you cross it, they don't know where you're going to be crossing, and so you've got a lot of opportunity to cross and take ground from there. And that's basically what I see the Ukrainians trying to do at this point in time.
Yep. Okay, moving on from that, briefly, we were asking in the last episode.
Hang on. Before that, we'll say hello to Portland Lily.
Oh yeah. Hello, Portland Lily.
Has just joined the chat as well.
Yeah. So moving on, last episode we were the first out of the gate asking the question, what is wrong with Israel's trophy system? Why are their tanks getting destroyed in around Gaza? And the answer appears to be there's a couple of them. One is that Hezbollah in August were actually advertising it. If you go back, and it's funny, it was August this year they were saying we've got this tandem is the wrong word to use. So it's Kornet missiles, which is a Russian missile system, anti-tank guided missile system, which uses a tandem warhead.
Mick, hello, Mick Loma.
Yeah. But the point is that they're putting two of them next to each other, so they fire as a single unit, and they have figured out that Trophy has a 1.4 second reload time between engagements. And so if they fire the two Kornet missiles within the 1.4 seconds, then they can defeat the Trophy active protection system.
As long as they're not coming on the same trajectory, otherwise the whatever shots are coming out from the Trophy are going to take out both.
Yes. Oh, well, it's coming in the same trajectory, but that's why they've got a time separation that's like 0.4 of a second.
Yeah, but 0.4 of a second traveling at those speeds, you've got to basically make sure that you're not coming in right behind. Otherwise, what you want to do.
They've worked out the timings and it apparently works. The big thing is if you're pointing directly at the Israeli tank's turret, then the trophy system on the other side can engage the target, the second one. So if you're staring straight down the barrel of the Merkava, then this system doesn't work. But if it's off bore, then you're in with a good chance. So this is why the exact engagement envelopes of these systems are kept so incredibly secret, because they can be defeated if you know exactly how they work. And the other thing that we've seen, and if we were a video only podcast, I would show it to you, but because we're mostly an audio audience, we won't, is incredibly brave dudes, Gazan dudes, jumping out of spider holes, running up to Israeli Merkava tanks as they rumble past, slapping some sort of
RPG warhead
charge, pulling a ripcord, and then where's the teamwork, guys? This dude has to run back to his spider hole, pick up what they're calling RPG 29s, which is a homemade Gazan tunnel-made RPG with a shaped charge, and then shooting this RPG at the tank that he's disabled the active protection system of.
So he's put the charge underneath the trophy radar. It's gone off, blown off the radar detection system, run back to his RPG and pick that up and then fired a round into it. And so, look, it's a nasty situation on every situation. Look, the fact that
I don't wish any Israelis dead in this, but no. I can still respect the bravery of the Palestinians who are fighting against a vastly superior foe.
And the fact that the Israelis have finally started to say that let's have a 4-hour ceasefire of bombarding civilians.
The Americans forced them, but
yeah, I know, that's what I was getting to, is that they've basically got to the point where nobody was taking their situation well, whereby they had to put in a 4-hour ceasefire in order to allow the women, the children, and the elderly to leave the target zones of the Israeli counterattack. So
I don't want to dwell on this, and I really want to move on, but I do find it quite horrific watching Israeli spokespeople saying phrases like, oh, if they use this humanitarian corridor now, we won't kill them, and then they just bomb the corridor. That seems like something that a different regime...
Oh, the Russians were doing that in Grozny as well. They would call a ceasefire, and when they would call the ceasefire, then they then use that ceasefire to bring in more artillery and tanks into position. And before the ceasefire was over, they would start using those things. That was back in the Chechen Wars of Grozny.
Let's just say we're talking about the Chechen Wars and not another larger conflict with some other ramifications that we don't particularly want to hang on Israelis right now. Okay.
All right. But during all this time, one of the fun ones is that there's not been a lot of coverage in the Western media of all the rocket attacks on the US bases in the Middle East, and especially in Syria.
Well, hang on. Rob, under what law, what part of international law is the US running bases in Syria. Has Syria ever signed a treaty to acknowledge the status of US forces in Syria?
Well, the border between Iraq and Syria is a bit fluid, isn't it?
Iraq, which
Or
is
is, it,
also
or is it a great big river that divides those two places and makes it very obvious for the last 3,000 years that this is one area and that's another?
yeah. Yeah, the fact that there are US bases in Syria, a country that has never given any permission for US bases to be in, I just find this is a really interesting way that the world's working. But yeah, the conflict is wide, and this is why the most powerful naval task force in history is gathering in the Eastern Mediterranean. A lot of stuff is about to go down. It's going to be bad for ordinary human beings.
So there's been about 34 rocket attacks on these US bases in these areas. Now they've come from various places: Syria, Iran, Iran, Iraq, and various peoples. Hasn't been a whole lot of damage, but the fact that it's actually happening and there's getting no coverage, very little coverage in Western media, is says something about where priorities are lying right now. Saying, yeah, we don't talk about Bruno. It's just one of those things. Yeah. Here you go.
Oh, do I? Okay.
Yes.
We're back to the Orion Dark.
The Orion. Tell people about the Orion.
Okinawa's Craft the Dark.
The Dark.
It's a lovely brown beer. We have often spoken about how all Japanese beer is good, and this is one of them.
And look, they've made big roads into the Australian market these days.
Well, they own it.
I was about to-
Asahi and Kirin own 90% of the Australian beer market.
Which is why I'm now finding it very easily to finding these things in my local bottle shop and saying, I've never seen that Japanese beer before, and I like Japanese beer, so I'm going to buy that for the Tank Podcast. And we're a Japanese Tank.
If you haven't done it, if you've never drunk Japanese beer, if you're part of the audience and haven't tasted it, it doesn't give you hangovers. Just bear that in mind.
I'll beg to disagree tomorrow, but anyway.
Yeah, well, yeah.
It's much better than a lot of other beers.
The local muck had a lot to do with that. Okay, so this is a delightful brown beer. I would rank it slightly higher than the Newcastle Brown Ale of last month, but it's really good. So give it a go. The Orion,
The Dark.
the Dark.
The Dark.
Okay.
Brewed in Okinawa.
Now we did promise last month.
5% alcohol, 350ml cans.
We promised last month that we'd talk about the future of the tank. And then we did get tired and emotional as that marathon 2.5 hour tank podcast went on.
Churchill.
And so initially I thought, oh, we just forgot it. And then I realized hadn't actually put it in the, we're running off a teleprompter now. This is how we're remembering all these facts and figures, my friends. So I hadn't actually put it in the script, and that's why we didn't talk about it, because it just wasn't there. So the future of the tank, the Drive's Warzone website, which is, it's very American centric, but it's quite good with in terms of any conflict, what's going on. They had accessed this study that the US had done about 5 years ago that was talking about the future of the tank, and apparently the recent war in Ukraine has focused a lot of minds. And one of the big things that the US appears to be moving towards is that they cannot field tanks over 50 tons, and they might have to even go down to 40 tons, simply because if your tank advance requires tactical bridging, it's too easy for the enemy intelligence to spot the tactical bridging units moving into position to, ford the streams and the crevasses. And, you've got Ukraine, their head of their army saying, oh, it's impossible to achieve strategic surprise in the modern era because there's drones watching everything and satellites. The counter argument is Hamas saying, hold my beer. Israel never saw this coming. So surprise is still achievable, but you need to make it as easy as possible to surprise the enemy. And if you've only got 3 tactical bridging units in theatre, then the position of those is going to be a fair indicator of where the axis of assault is coming from. And the point that this American study is making is that you need to make sure your tanks can move over the existing bridges so that you're not having to flag your advance with the movement of every other unit. This is interesting stuff, and it really makes the new is it the Booker? Anyway, the recent American light tank announcements.
Oh, the M10. I want to say. No.
Yeah, the M10, but I mean, I think Booker is what they also call the armored breaching vehicle. So that name's getting a bit complicated right now. But
should have written in the notes, John.
oh yeah, should have. Anyway, the point is that the tanks are going to get lighter. My personal view is that tanks essentially follow warships by about 50 years, and that means that electronic warfare has to move into the tank. The tank is going to be an electronic warfare node. Its gun is going to be less important than what it does on the electronic warfare front. That's my guess about the future.
Mine is that there will be, standardization and single design is so important for logistics, support, training, compatibility, and everything else. However, they're probably going to go down the path of a case of we're going to have heavy and light. And the heavies are going to be your manned versions, and they're going to have...
we're moving away from the year of the main battle tank. It's going to be more specialized vehicles.
The thing is, the heavy is going to be your main battle tank with all the protection and it's going to be 60, 70, 80 tons, right? That's going to be, and it's going to do all that. And your light is going to be your unmanned version, and it's going to have all the stuff that you need to be able to do. And the two working in tandem is going to be what is going to be providing to is what's going to be going forward. Now, whether or not they can convince the people with the checkbooks to do that will be a big question, because by having the lighter tanks being either one or none person involved, that's going to be a huge cost saver, and they'll be able to sell that. But they still need the heavies to be able to do the actual job.
Yeah, that's kind of why countries like the UK are moving to tank forces of a couple of hundred tanks, or even Australia with the M1s. And those are your heavy breakthrough units. And Raghow has asked, so tanks will be launching planes soon. Well, literally,
drones.
Ryan Mittal's latest design has a drone launcher in it.
There are plenty of them going around at the moment.
And one of the funny things out of the Ukraine war is watching that the biggest use of a drone for a lot of tanks is just to sit directly above the tank, so they can see if someone's shooting at them, where that's coming from.
And which place there'll come a time where your drone will be just involved in counter drone activities, because what's better to counter a drone than another drone? And Gundam styles, Gundam design from the T-80. I have not seen. As Brandon Make Stuff has asked the question, I'm sure the T-80 has inspired at least one Gundam design. I can't think of it. I wouldn't be surprised. But then again,
I think it's just lumped in what the British call just Russian T-tanks. Because it doesn't, depending on what party dress it's wearing, it doesn't, and this is why our audience really struggled with identifying it as in the Guess the Tank competition. It just looks like a T-72 or a T-90, depending on what armor package it's got on.
Yeah, which is nowadays, with the refurbished T-80Bs, it's got lots of armor on it, lots of various ERA slapped on the outside, and the cope cages and the slat armor and everything else. Look, John, I think we've covered everything on the T-80. Now, where do we end up on our poll?
So the poll is 63% say the T-80 is good, and 37% say it is bad, and that's 19 votes.
So for a tank that was developed 47 years ago,
and production was abandoned in the 1990s and has been reopened since, the T-80 is making a comeback.
And so it's being used by a number of different people in a number of different conflicts at the moment. And look, that gas turbine has shown itself to be very useful.
It needs an auxiliary power unit. I mean, that's what everyone figured out. After the, pioneers get arrows in their asses, and that was what happened with the T-80. Was that it was the first turbine tank, and that was where everyone learned that.
We're watching we're reading Alan's statement at the moment.
Oh, right.
So, Indian chins of Japan. Oh, hang on.
Got to be careful reading Alan's stuff. Yes. Alan always has really good insights, but they're often a bit oblique. Anyway, Alexander Vlad notes that Nikolai Popov in a Gundam like 40K Dreadnought would.
Okay,
yeah.
so for those who don't know,
Popov was the designer of the T-80.
and of course, dreadnoughts in the 40K universe are basically you take your heroes, you encase them in a sarcophagus, and you slap them inside a dreadnought who can stomp around the Gundam and stomp around the battlefield to fight the Emperor's enemies for thousands of years to come.
Alan has finalised saying T-80 sucks the big Tangier. So
I think we'll wrap it up there.
that's a good point to finish. Folks, thank you so much for everyone who's been on the live stream, and we of course do not forget our podcast audience at all. You guys are the show, and we will.
Thank you to our patrons, and if you want some t-shirts, the redbubble.com look for Totally Tanked, and see you next month.
Okay, folks.